There is a moment right before sleep when your body is completely still, but something inside your head is quietly turning on, not thinking, not planning, not worrying in the usual way, just replaying scenes you didn't invite, voices you thought were gone, moments from the day that felt insignificant suddenly growing sharp and clear, as if your mind saved them for this exact second. Most people believe sleep begins when the eyes close, but that is not when it begins. Sleep begins when your brain decides it's time to look back. And if you've ever wondered why the past feels louder at night, why memories choose the bed as their stage, why the mind seems unwilling to let go just when you need rest the most, then stay here, because what's happening right now is not random, and it's not weakness. Before we go any further, if you're listening to this and something about it already feels familiar, if these quiet explanations are the kind you want to come back to, take a second to support this space. Like this recording, share it with someone who struggles to fall asleep, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings so these nighttime investigations don't disappear into the noise. Now, let your shoulders drop. You don't need to remember everything that follows. Your brain will decide what matters. Because while you think you're preparing to sleep, your mind is preparing something else entirely. It doesn't shut down. It reorganizes. All day long, your brain absorbs more information than it can possibly handle in real time. Conversations, expressions, half-finished thoughts, emotional reactions you didn't notice when they happened. During the day, there's no space to deal with them. Movement, noise, tasks, everything stacks on top of everything else. But when the lights go off, that pressure lifts, and what rises to the surface isn't chosen by you. It's chosen by priority, not logical priority, not importance as you would define it, but emotional weight. The brain doesn't care what was productive. It cares what was unresolved. That's why a casual comment from a stranger can echo louder than an entire workday. That's why an old memory can appear without warning, unannounced, just as your breathing slows. This isn't your mind trying to torture you. It's your mind trying to clean. Think of your brain as a room that was used all day without pause. Chairs moved, papers scattered, small objects knocked to the floor. While you were busy living, there was no time to put anything back. So the moment activity stops, the cleanup begins. Sleep is not rest first. Sleep is sorting first. And sorting requires opening boxes you'd rather keep closed, especially the ones labeled unfinished. Unfinished conversations, unprocessed emotions, moments that didn't hurt enough to cry over, but hurt enough to be stored without resolution. Your brain doesn't replay them because they matter consciously. It replays them because they were never given a conclusion. And here's where the feeling changes, because most people interpret this replay as a sign of attachment, or regret, or emotional weakness. They think, why am I still thinking about this? Why can't I let it go? But the truth is quieter than that. Your brain isn't asking you to relive the moment. It's asking permission to file it away. And it can't do that until it understands how it made you feel. During the day, your body is too busy responding to the world to fully register internal signals. Heart rate changes, muscle tension, shifts in breathing that signal stress, safety, anticipation, disappointment. These things happen in the background, unnoticed. At night, there is nothing left to distract from them. So the brain brings back the memory, not as punishment, but as a way to finally attach the missing emotional data. This is why memories before sleep don't feel like watching a video. They feel like stepping back into a sensation. The room you were in, the tone of a voice, the subtle pause that felt wrong but didn't register until now. Your brain isn't replaying events, it's replaying states. And this is why certain people appear more often than others, not because they were important in your life in a dramatic way, but because they were connected to a version of you that felt something intensely, safe, unsafe, seen, invisible, valued, dismissed. At night, your brain doesn't search for faces, it searches for signals, signals of connection, signals of threat, signals of belonging. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. A brain that ignores unresolved social cues doesn't survive long. Losing connection used to mean danger. Isolation meant death. So the mind evolved to revisit anything that might threaten social stability, even long after the actual danger is gone, even when the person is no longer part of your life. So when someone from your past appears as you lie in bed, it doesn't mean you want them back. It means your nervous system is checking something. Was that connection safe? Was it resolved? Did we learn what we needed to learn? And if the answer is unclear, the brain doesn't move on. It replays. Here's the part most people don't realize. Every time a memory is replayed, it changes. The brain doesn't store memories like files on a hard drive. Each recall is a reconstruction, a rewriting. The emotion associated with the memory can soften, shift, or detach slightly each time it's revisited, especially during sleep. That's why a memory that once felt sharp can eventually feel distant, not erased, just quieter. Sleep is the mechanism that allows this softening to happen. But only if the brain is allowed to complete the process. When you fight the memory, when you tense up, scroll your phone, force distraction, the process is interrupted. The memory stays unresolved. The emotional charge remains intact, and so it returns, night after night. Not because you're stuck, but because your brain is patient. It will wait until the conditions are right. And the right conditions look like this: stillness, darkness, a body that isn't moving, a mind that isn't performing. Only then does the brain feel safe enough to open the boxes it kept sealed all day. This is why lying in bed feels different from sitting on a couch. The body position itself signals vulnerability. You are horizontal, defenseless, temporarily disconnected from action. To the nervous system, this is a cue. Now is the time to check for unresolved threats. Now is the time to replay. But here's the twist that changes everything. The brain is not trying to keep you awake. It's trying to help you sleep better tomorrow. The goal of replay is not awareness, it's resolution. During certain phases of sleep, especially the deeper ones, the brain begins to disconnect emotional intensity from memory content. The image remains, the lesson remains, but the charge fades. This is emotional processing at its most fundamental level, not through language, not through understanding, through repetition and release. And that means something important. If your mind feels busy right now, it doesn't mean sleep is failing. It means sleep is being prepared. The replay you're experiencing is the opening act, not the interruption. You don't need to solve the memory. You don't need to judge it. You don't even need to understand why this one appeared instead of another. All you need to do is allow it to exist without resistance. Because the moment you stop trying to push it away, the brain begins to do something subtle. It starts to loosen the grip. thoughts slow, images blur, emotions lose their edges, and without you noticing the exact second it happens, the replay stops being sharp enough to hold your attention. That's when sleep arrives, not suddenly, not dramatically, but like a dimming light you forgot was on. So if your mind is active right now, that's okay. It doesn't mean tonight will be another restless night. It may mean this is the last time a certain memory needs to be replayed with this much intensity. Because once the brain finishes sorting, once it decides the file is safe to store, it moves on. And what happens next, what the mind chooses to replay, what it chooses to release, and why certain memories return while others fade, that's where the real story begins. Because not all memories are treated equally, and the ones that return most often before sleep are usually pointing towards something deeper than the past. When the last sound of the day fades, something subtle changes inside your head. It isn't silence, it isn't rest, it's permission. Permission for the brain to do the work it postponed while you were busy surviving the day. Because during waking hours, your mind is not designed to reflect. It's designed to respond. Respond to movement, respond to language, respond to danger, expectation, timing. Every second you're awake, your brain is making fast decisions. What to ignore, what to prioritize, what can wait. And most of what can wait does. Thoughts get pushed aside, emotions get delayed, sensations get muted, not erased, just stacked. By the time night arrives, your brain is carrying far more than you realize. And when your body finally stops moving, when there's no longer a need to perform or react, the brain takes that stillness as a signal. Now we can clean, not in the way you might imagine, not by wiping everything away, but by sorting. Imagine a room used continuously all day long, people coming in and out, objects picked up and set down in the wrong places. Small things knocked over without anyone noticing. No time to fix it, no time to organize. That's your mind by evening. Sleep does not begin by turning off the lights in that room. Sleep begins by walking through it slowly, deciding what belongs where. This is why your thoughts don't shut down immediately. They line up. Your brain starts by identifying what doesn't fit. Unfinished conversations, unanswered questions, moments that carried emotional weight but were never fully felt. These aren't chosen consciously. They rise because they're unstable. Your brain doesn't want disorder overnight. Disorder means unpredictability, and unpredictability to the nervous system means danger. So it starts with what feels loose, that comment you brushed off but didn't quite believe, that moment you laughed through but didn't process, that feeling you postponed because there wasn't time for it then. Now there is time. And here's where many people misunderstand what's happening. They think the brain is reviewing the day to judge it, to criticize, to replay mistakes. But judgment is not the goal. Stability is. The brain doesn't care if something was good or bad. It cares whether it was resolved. A resolved experience is easy to store. An unresolved one keeps leaking energy. So the brain returns to it, not with words, with sensations. The tightness in your chest, the sudden heaviness behind the eyes, the shift in breathing when a memory surfaces. These are not side effects. They are the language the brain uses to decide where something belongs. During the day, logic dominates. At night, the body speaks first. That's why thoughts before sleep feel different from thoughts at any other time. They are slower, less structured, more emotional, less interested in explanation. Your brain isn't trying to make sense of the story. It's trying to settle the state. This is the part that feels uncomfortable, because settling requires revisiting, and revisiting feels like regression if you don't understand the process. You might think, why am I thinking about this again? I already dealt with it. But dealing with something intellectually is not the same as processing it neurologically. Your brain needs to feel that something is no longer a threat before it can let it go. And feeling takes time. So as you lie there, thoughts drift in, not aggressively, not all at once, but one at a time, each carrying a small charge, each asking a quiet question. Is this safe now? Is this finished? Can we rest? If the answer is unclear, the brain doesn't panic. It simply keeps the memory close. This is where the sensation of mental clutter comes from. Not because your brain is overwhelmed, but because it is carefully deciding what can be put away. What makes this process feel heavier at night is the absence of distraction. During the day, attention is scattered outward. Your senses are busy. Your mind is anchored to the environment. There's always something to react to. At night, that anchor disappears. Attention turns inward by default. And inward, there is a backlog, so thoughts appear larger, louder, more personal, not because they grew, but because there's nothing else competing with them. This is why trying to force sleep rarely works. Sleep isn't a switch you flip. It's a transition you allow. The brain needs to finish sorting before it can let go. And the more you resist the process, the longer it takes. Scrolling your phone doesn't stop the cleaning. It delays it. Distraction doesn't erase unresolved material. It postpones it. So, when the lights go off again the next night, the same items rise to the surface, not because you're stuck, but because the brain remembers where it left off. Here's another quiet truth. The brain cleans in layers. It doesn't tackle the heaviest material first. It starts with what feels manageable. That's why some nights are light and others feel dense. Some evenings, your mind drifts through ordinary moments, neutral memories, small details from the day. Those are easy to file. They pass quickly. Other nights, the brain reaches deeper into older material, heavier emotions, experiences that shaped you more than you realized at the time. These nights feel longer, not because they are worse, but because the brain is doing more important work. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign of access. The mind only opens deeper layers when the body feels safe enough to be still, which is why exhaustion often makes memories surface faster. When you're tired, your defenses are lower. Your ability to suppress decreases. The brain takes advantage of that openness, not to hurt you, but to finally finish something. And here's the part that changes how you experience these moments. The brain doesn't clean to relive the past. It cleans to prepare for the future. A cluttered mind reacts slower. A mind carrying unresolved emotion misinterprets neutral signals. It overreacts. It withdraws. It stays tense. So the brain uses the quiet of night to recalibrate, to release what no longer needs to be carried forward. But it can only do that if you let the process unfold, if you stay still long enough, if you stop demanding silence from your thoughts, if you allow memories to pass without engaging them. You don't need to analyze. You don't need to correct. You don't need to push anything away. Awareness without resistance is enough. Because once the brain senses that a memory no longer triggers action, it begins to downgrade its importance. The emotional charge weakens. The image softens, the thought loses clarity, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mind begins to drift. Not because the thoughts stopped, but because they no longer require attention. This is how sleep arrives, not as absence of thought, but as the absence of urgency. So if your mind feels active right now, consider this. What you're experiencing may not be noise. It may be the sound of order being restored. And once the brain finishes deciding what belongs to today, what belongs to the past, and what no longer needs to be carried at all, it moves on to something more specific. Because among all the memories it sorts at night, there is a category it treats with special care, the ones tied not to events, but to people. And those are handled differently. When your mind begins to slow, there's a certain kind of memory that refuses to fade with it. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. It doesn't arrive like a clear picture. It comes as a feeling that won't settle, a subtle tension, a quiet pull. These are the memories that don't stay where you left them. They surface not because they are recent and not because they were important in an obvious way, but because they never fully came to rest. During the day, your brain has a simple rule. Anything that doesn't demand immediate action gets postponed. A strange look someone gave you, a sentence that ended too early, a moment where you felt something shift, but didn't stop to name it. Nothing urgent, nothing you could point to and say, "This matters." So your brain tagged it and moved on. But tags are not closures, they are placeholders. And when night arrives, placeholders begin to glow. Your brain is remarkably sensitive to instability. It can tolerate discomfort, uncertainty, even pain. But it struggles with open loops. Anything incomplete keeps a low-level signal running in the background, quietly draining attention and energy. So before sleep, the brain scans for what's still active, not in words, in sensation. That's why these memories don't feel like thoughts. They feel like states. A heaviness in the chest that doesn't have a name. A warmth behind the eyes that isn't quite sadness. A sudden stillness that feels familiar. But you can't place where it came from. These sensations are markers. They tell the brain, this one isn't done yet. And here's where the process deepens. Your brain does not reopen every unfinished memory at once. That would be overwhelming. Instead, it brings them up one at a time, often starting with the ones that carry emotional ambiguity. Not joy, not trauma, but the in-between. Moments that were confusing rather than painful. Connections that faded instead of breaking. Situations where nothing clearly went wrong, but nothing clearly resolved either. These memories are harder to store. The brain likes clarity, clear danger, clear safety, clear endings. Ambiguity resists filing, so it lingers. That's why you might suddenly think of someone you haven't seen in years without any obvious reason. Not someone who hurt you deeply, not someone you miss actively. Just someone unfinished. The brain isn't asking whether you want them back. It's asking whether the situation ever truly ended. Because an ending isn't defined by time. It's defined by emotional completion. And without that, the memory stays flexible, ready to be reactivated. This is where many people misinterpret what's happening. They assume the appearance of a memory means desire or regret or attachment that never healed. But often, it means something much simpler. The brain never got confirmation that it was safe to let go. During waking hours, confirmation comes from action, from conversation, from closure rituals, from decisions made out loud. At night, confirmation comes internally, through replay, but replay isn't repetition, it's testing. Your brain brings the memory back and quietly watches your response. Does your body tense? Does your breathing change? Does the emotional charge spike or stay neutral? If the response is still strong, the brain keeps the file open. If the response is weaker than before, the brain adjusts the memory's weight. This is why the same memory can return multiple nights in a row, not because nothing changed, but because something is changing slowly. Each replay slightly alters the emotional imprint. Each revisit makes the edges less sharp unless resistance keeps them intact. Here's the part that often goes unnoticed. The brain does not need you to think about the memory for this process to work. It only needs you not to interfere. Analysis, judgment, storytelling. These actually slow things down. They pull the memory back into conscious control, where the brain has less access to emotional recalibration. What the brain prefers is passive awareness, letting the image pass without grabbing it, letting the sensation exist without labeling it, letting the thought drift without finishing the sentence. This is difficult, not because it's complex, but because it feels counterintuitive. We're trained to solve what appears, but before sleep, solving is not required. Allowing is. And when you allow a memory to surface without resistance, something subtle begins to happen. The memory stops behaving like a signal and starts behaving like background. It doesn't disappear. It just loses urgency. This is the moment the brain is waiting for, because urgency is what keeps a memory active. Once urgency fades, the brain can finally decide where it belongs: long-term storage or quiet release. But there is a specific category of memory that resists this process more than others. Memories tied to people, not events, not places, people. Because people aren't static experiences, they are relationships. They involve expectation, attachment, safety, and the brain treats them differently. Which is why, as the night deepens and thoughts become less structured, the mind often drifts toward faces rather than scenes, voices rather than actions, and the question quietly shifts from what happened to who was there. That shift is not accidental. It marks the point where memory processing moves from information to connection, and that's where things become more complicated. When memories begin to shift from moments to faces, the rules change. Events can be archived, scenes can be softened, but people carry something heavier, because when your brain remembers a person, it is not recalling a snapshot of who they were. It is reactivating a pattern, the sound of their voice, the way your body adjusted around them, the sense of ease or tension that appeared when they were near. These are not stored as stories. They are stored as states of regulation. Your nervous system learned something in the presence of each person you encountered, learned whether to relax or stay alert, whether to open or protect, whether it was safe to be fully yourself or necessary to perform. During the day, those learned states stay quiet. At night, they speak. That's why memories of people arrive differently than other thoughts. They don't feel like recollections. They feel like shifts in your body, a sudden warmth, a subtle tightness, a calm that surprises you, or an unease that doesn't make sense in the present moment. Your brain isn't asking, "Do you remember this person?" It's asking, "Is this pattern still relevant?" From a survival perspective, this question matters more than logic. Human brains evolved to stay alive through connection. Being accepted meant protection. Being rejected meant danger. So the nervous system became highly skilled at tracking interpersonal signals and storing them for future reference, even long after the situation has changed. So when you lie down at night and someone from your past appears without invitation, it's not because the brain is nostalgic. It's because the brain is checking its internal map. Is this connection resolved? Is this threat gone? Is this safety pattern still needed? And if the answer is unclear, the brain doesn't discard the memory. It keeps it accessible. This is where the experience often becomes confusing. You might think, why am I thinking about this person? I don't even feel anything for them anymore. But feelings are not the measure the brain uses. Regulation is. A person can leave your life, but the pattern your nervous system learned around them can remain active, especially if that pattern was formed during a period of vulnerability, especially if it shaped how you learned to relate to others afterward. The brain doesn't erase these patterns easily. It waits until it is certain they are no longer required. Night is when that evaluation happens, because during the day, your nervous system is busy responding to the present. It adjusts continuously to new people, new environments, new demands. There's no space to revisit older patterns. At night, the system finally goes offline from the outside world. And that's when internal checks begin. Your brain brings up a person not to remember them, but to observe you. How does your body respond now? Is there tension where there used to be comfort? Is there neutrality where there used to be pain? Is there still a charge at all? These responses tell the brain whether the pattern is still active. If the response is strong, the pattern stays. If the response is weak, the brain starts to loosen its grip. This loosening doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, through repetition. That's why the same person might appear in your thoughts across multiple nights, each time feeling slightly different. One night, the memory feels heavy. Another night, distant. Another night, almost irrelevant. These are signs of recalibration. The brain is updating its internal model. And here's an important distinction. This process is not emotional longing. It's neurological housekeeping. Longing involves desire. Recalibration involves measurement. The brain is not asking whether you want the person back. It's asking whether the pattern they represent still influences how you respond to the world. And until that influence fades, the memory remains active. This is also why certain people return to the mind more often during periods of stress or exhaustion. When you're tired, your nervous system becomes more sensitive. Old patterns surface more easily because the brain is scanning for familiar ways to regulate itself, not because those patterns are healthy, but because they are known. Familiar regulation, even if imperfect, feels safer to the brain than uncertainty. So under fatigue, the mind may reach for old connections simply because they once worked. This doesn't mean you're regressing, it means your system is seeking stability. Nighttime makes this process more visible because there's no external input to override it, no conversations to redirect attention, no tasks to absorb focus, no movement to discharge tension. Just you, and the internal signals that usually stay beneath awareness. This is why trying to reason your way out of these memories rarely helps. Logic doesn't dismantle nervous system patterns. Experience does. And the experience the brain is waiting for is a simple one: neutrality. The moment a memory of a person can appear, without triggering a shift in your body, the brain receives the signal it needs. This pattern is no longer necessary, but neutrality cannot be forced. It emerges through exposure without reaction, through allowing the memory to exist without engaging it, through letting the body feel and then settle. This is why lying still is so important. Movement interrupts the process. Distraction delays it. Analysis complicates it. Stillness allows the nervous system to complete the loop. And once that loop is complete, the memory loses its power to pull you out of the present. It becomes information, not influence. But not all memories of people reach neutrality easily. Some resist. Some carry layers, safety mixed with loss, comfort mixed with uncertainty, closeness mixed with unresolved endings. These are the memories the brain treats with the most caution, because misclassifying them would be costly. So the brain returns to them again and again, each time testing, each time adjusting, each time waiting for a response that finally says, "This no longer shapes how I need to survive." And when that response arrives, even faintly, the brain begins to do something subtle. It stops bringing the person forward as an image and starts dissolving them into sensation. That transition from face to feeling is quiet, easy to miss, but it marks a turning point. Because once a memory no longer needs a face to carry its meaning, it is ready to be transformed. And that transformation doesn't happen while you're awake. It happens when the mind slips into a deeper state, where images lose their sharpness, where logic releases its grip, where emotion can finally be separated from identity. That is where sleep begins to do its most important work. And it raises a deeper question. If the brain is willing to reopen memories of people long gone, what exactly is it trying to heal? And how does sleep accomplish that without words? When the mind drifts deeper and faces begin to blur, the work doesn't stop, it changes form. What your brain is trying to heal is not the memory itself. Memories don't need healing. They are records. What needs healing is the response your body learned to carry alongside them. Because every meaningful interaction leaves behind a trace, not just in thought, but in physiology. A learned tightening, a learned caution, a learned readiness. These traces are efficient. They help you adapt. They help you survive. But they are also stubborn. Once formed, they don't disappear simply because time passes. They wait. Sleep is where the brain finally has access to them, not through reasoning, through state change. As you descend towards sleep, your nervous system shifts gears. Heart rate slows, muscle tone drops. The part of the brain responsible for constant monitoring begins to relax its grip. This transition is not just rest, it's opportunity, because certain patterns can only be altered when the system is no longer on guard. During waking hours, your brain prioritizes prediction. It scans for what might happen next. It prepares responses before they're needed. That vigilance keeps old patterns intact, because changing them mid-action would be risky. At night, prediction loosens, and when prediction loosens, memory becomes flexible. This is why emotional memories feel different before sleep, not sharper, but more fluid. They lose their edges. They stop insisting on one interpretation. The brain is no longer asking, "What should we do if this happens again?" It's asking something else entirely. What if this doesn't need to happen again at all? That question cannot be answered consciously. It must be felt. So the brain recreates a state similar to the original experience, but in a safer context. Lying down, eyes closed, body still. No immediate consequences. This is not reliving, it's simulation. The brain allows the sensation to arise while withholding action. No response is required, no defense, no performance, just presence. And in that presence, something important happens. The nervous system realizes it can experience the memory without mobilizing, without tightening, without preparing, without bracing. This realization is subtle. You won't notice it as a breakthrough. It doesn't arrive with insight. It arrives as less tension, less urgency, less pull. That reduction is the signal the brain is waiting for. It means the memory no longer predicts danger. And when a memory no longer predicts danger, it no longer needs to stay close to consciousness. This is the beginning of healing, not closure in the narrative sense, closure in the physiological sense. The body updates its expectations, and once expectations change, attention can finally drift. This process explains something many people struggle to understand: why memories feel more emotional at night, but less painful over time. Why something that once triggered immediate reaction can later appear quietly without demand. Sleep doesn't erase memories. It downgrades their priority. It teaches the nervous system what no longer needs guarding. But this teaching requires repetition. One night is rarely enough. The brain is cautious. It prefers gradual change. It revisits, tests, observes. Each night is another data point. Is the response weaker? Is the body calmer? Is the pattern dissolving? If yes, the brain continues. If not, it tries again later. This is why healing often feels non-linear. Some nights feel lighter, others feel heavier. Not because progress reversed, but because the brain reached a different layer. Healing isn't a straight path downward, it's a spiral. The same themes appear at different depths, each time with slightly less intensity, until one night the memory arrives and barely registers. It passes like background noise, and you don't realize anything has changed until you notice how easily sleep follows. No effort, no struggle, just drift. But there is a complication. Not all memories are purely emotional. Some are tied to identity, to how you learn to see yourself, and those are treated differently, because altering them doesn't just change how you feel, it changes who you believe you are. The brain approaches those with care, which is why certain memories, especially those tied to shame, belonging, or worth, linger longer than others. They are not just experiences, they are reference points. And before the brain can soften them, it must understand something crucial: whether the version of you that formed around them is still needed. That evaluation doesn't happen in thought. It happens in a quieter place, where language fades, where images dissolve, where only sensation remains. And as the mind continues to slow, moving closer to true sleep, the process deepens again. Because beyond memory, beyond people, there is another layer the brain begins to touch, one that has less to do with the past and more to do with who you are becoming. As sleep pulls you further away from clear thought, the brain stops asking what happened and starts asking what still matters. This is a quieter question, less specific, more internal. By this point, memories no longer arrive as scenes or faces. They arrive as impressions, subtle beliefs your body carries without language, expectations, assumptions, invisible rules you learned long before you knew you were learning them. Rules like, stay alert, don't get too close, be useful, to be safe. Silence keeps you protected. These aren't thoughts you remember thinking. They're conclusions your nervous system reached after repeating certain experiences enough times. And once learned, they don't announce themselves. They operate in the background. During the day, these patterns guide behavior automatically. They shape how you speak, how you hesitate, how you read a room before entering it. They help you adapt so smoothly that you forget they're there. At night, adaptation pauses, and that's when the brain notices what it's been carrying. Sleep creates a rare condition where identity can soften, where the roles you perform lose definition, where the future is temporarily irrelevant. In this state, the brain revisits not what you did, but how you learned to be. This is why certain feelings surface without any clear memory attached, a sense of unease with no image, a sudden sadness with no story, a weight that feels older than the day you just lived. These sensations are not coming from specific events, they're coming from patterns, and patterns don't dissolve easily. The brain formed them to protect you. So before it lets them go, it needs proof they're no longer required. That proof cannot come from thinking. It comes from experience without consequence. Night provides that experience. As your body lies still and your breathing slows, the nervous system enters a state that resembles safety without effort. No one is watching. Nothing is expected. There is no role to play. For the brain, this is unusual and informative. It begins to notice something subtle. Nothing bad is happening. Even without vigilance, no threat appears. Even without preparation. This observation weakens old assumptions, not immediately, not dramatically, but enough to matter. The brain starts testing its beliefs. What if alertness isn't needed right now? What if closeness doesn't lead to harm? What if rest itself is allowed? These are not questions you hear. They are shifts you feel. A small drop in tension, a longer exhale, a loosening in the jaw or shoulders. These changes are data. They tell the brain that certain patterns may be outdated. And once a pattern is suspected to be outdated, the brain begins a slow disengagement. This is where many people misunderstand the sensation of nighttime vulnerability. They think feeling exposed before sleep means something is wrong. But vulnerability is not danger. It's access. The brain only allows core patterns to surface when it believes the environment is safe enough to survive the update. If you were truly unsafe, the system would stay guarded. So the very discomfort people try to avoid before sleep is often evidence that the brain trusts the moment enough to change. This is also why nights of emotional heaviness often follow periods of growth. When you move closer to becoming someone different, someone less defended, less reactive, less shaped by old wounds, the brain must adjust the internal map. And adjusting maps requires revisiting landmarks, old identities, old rules, old ways of staying intact. The brain doesn't tear these down. It dissolves them slowly, layer by layer, which is why healing before sleep feels ambiguous. You might feel tired but restless, calm but emotional, safe but exposed. These states are not contradictions. They are transitions. The nervous system is between modes, no longer fully protected, not yet fully at rest. This is where the mind often produces vague, drifting thoughts, half-formed ideas, images that don't quite connect, feelings without clear origin. This mental fog is not dysfunction. It's the sign that rigid structure is loosening, and when structure loosens, deeper recalibration becomes possible. But this process has limits. The brain will not dissolve patterns faster than the body can tolerate. If a belief is tied to survival, the system approaches it with caution. It may take many nights, many quiet checks, many moments of safety before the pattern weakens enough to release. This patience is intentional. Sudden change feels dangerous to the nervous system, even positive change. So the brain proceeds gently, testing, observing, waiting, until one night, without you realizing when it happened, a familiar tension simply doesn't appear. A thought that used to pull now passes through. A belief that once guided reaction no longer activates. And you don't celebrate this. You don't even notice it right away. You just sleep. But beneath that sleep, something important has shifted. Because when the brain releases a pattern tied to identity, it creates space. And space does not remain empty for long. It invites something new, a different way of responding, a different sense of self, a quieter baseline. As the mind continues its descent, moving beyond memory and belief, it approaches a deeper layer still, one that doesn't ask who you were, but listens for what remains when those layers fall away. And that layer is felt not as thought, but as rhythm, breath, heartbeat, timing. This is where the brain prepares for its final transition of the night, and where the replay finally begins to slow. As thoughts lose their edges, the brain stops working with meaning and starts working with rhythm. This is a deeper shift than most people realize. Meaning belongs to waking life. Stories belong to identity. Language belongs to control, but rhythm belongs to the body. Breath, heartbeat, the subtle timing between tension and release. When the mind reaches this layer, memory no longer appears as images or emotions. It appears as patterns of activation, waves rising and falling without explanation. You might notice it as a strange drifting sensation, not quite asleep, not quite awake. Thoughts come, but they don't connect. Feelings move through you without names. This is not confusion, it's deconstruction. The brain is disengaging from narrative, because narratives are heavy. They carry cause, responsibility, self-concept. They require a stable sense of me to hold them together. Sleep cannot begin fully while narrative remains active, so the brain loosens it gently by shifting attention away from meaning and toward repetition. In this state, the brain listens more than it thinks. It listens to breath slowing on its own. It listens to the heart finding a steadier pace. It listens to the nervous system deciding that nothing needs immediate response. This listening is not passive, it's regulatory. The brain uses rhythm as a signal of safety. Predictable timing means the environment is stable. No sudden changes, no urgent demands. When rhythm stabilizes, vigilance fades, and when vigilance fades, the final barriers to sleep begin to dissolve. This is why focusing on breath sometimes helps you sleep, but only when you're not trying to control it. Control keeps the mind engaged. Observation allows rhythm to take over. The brain doesn't need instruction here. It needs permission. Permission to stop scanning. Permission to stop interpreting. Permission to stop holding shape. And once that permission is sensed, something subtle happens. The replay slows. Memories that were once sharp become abstract. Faces lose features. Emotions flatten into tone. The mind stops asking questions, not because they were answered, but because they no longer matter in this state. This is the point where many people feel a brief sense of falling, a sudden drop, a jolt, a twitch. This is not danger. it's transition. The nervous system is switching modes, handing control from conscious monitoring to automatic regulation, from cortex to deeper structures, from thinking to being. The body reacts because change, even safe change, requires recalibration. Once the handoff completes, awareness thins. Thoughts no longer line up. Time loses continuity. The boundary between one moment and the next softens. This is not the absence of mind. It's the mind turning inward, toward maintenance, repair, integration, rebalancing. Everything you experienced earlier, the replay, the memories, the emotions, the identity checks, were preparation. They were the brain ensuring that nothing unstable followed you into unconsciousness. Only when it feels confident that the system is coherent enough does it let go completely. And this is where the deepest work happens, beyond awareness, beyond memory, beyond self. In the next phase, the brain begins consolidating what it has sorted, strengthening some connections, weakening others, deciding what will shape you tomorrow and what will not. But none of that is accessible from here. From this edge, all you can sense is slowing, a widening gap between thoughts, a heaviness that feels almost comforting, a sense that effort is no longer required. If you notice this happening, you don't need to follow it. Following reactivates control. You simply allow yourself to sink into it. Because from this point forward, the brain no longer needs your cooperation. It knows what to do. And while you drift into deeper sleep, it continues its work quietly, reshaping emotional weight, dissolving unnecessary patterns, reinforcing what keeps you balanced. What you experience as losing consciousness is simply the mind releasing its grip on the surface. What remains underneath is still active, still aware in its own way, still preparing you for what comes next. And when you eventually rise from sleep, feeling lighter or heavier without knowing why, that will be the evidence of this unseen labor. But before morning arrives, there is still one more layer to pass through, a layer where even rhythm fades, and the brain enters a state unlike anything you experience while awake. That is where the night truly takes over, and where the mind finally stops replaying the day and begins to rewrite what it will become. There is a point in the night when even rhythm begins to dissolve. Breath no longer feels counted. Heartbeat no longer feels noticed. The steady patterns that guided you downward loosen their grip. This is not the moment of sleep yet. It is the threshold, the place where the brain decides whether it can finally let go of conscious supervision. Up until now, everything you experienced, the replay of memories, the return of faces, the softening of emotions, the fading of identity, has been preparation, a gradual unwinding, a careful lowering of internal noise so deeper processes can begin without interruption. But before the brain releases awareness completely, it performs one last subtle check. It listens for disturbance, not from the outside world, from within, because the greatest threats to rest do not come from sound or light. They come from unresolved signals buried deep in the nervous system, signals that say, stay alert, don't drop your guard, something isn't safe yet. These signals are rarely loud. They are whispers, a faint unease, a sense of anticipation without object, a feeling that something might happen even though nothing ever does. Most people experience this as restlessness, not racing thoughts, not anxiety in the usual sense. Just the inability to fully sink. This is not failure, it is caution. The brain is protective by nature. It evolved to assume that stillness is vulnerability. In the wild, falling asleep too deeply, too quickly, could mean not waking up at all. So even in the safety of modern life, the nervous system carries that ancient logic. Before it allows you to disappear into unconsciousness, it wants reassurance. Not reassurance from thought, from state. The brain looks for signs that your body can remain inactive without consequence. It observes muscle tone. It monitors breathing depth. It measures how easily attention detaches from internal stimuli. If something inside keeps pulling awareness back, an emotion, a sensation, a half-formed concern, the brain delays the transition, not to punish, but to protect. This is why, on some nights, you feel as if you're hovering just above sleep. Thoughts are distant, sensations are muted, but you're not fully gone. The brain is waiting for the final signal that says it's okay to let go now. That signal often comes as emotional neutrality, not happiness, not calm in the dramatic sense, but absence of urgency. When nothing inside demands immediate response, the brain loosens its last hold. And here's the part that surprises most people. Emotional neutrality does not come from resolving every issue. It comes from recognizing that nothing needs to be solved right now. This recognition is not verbal, it's physiological. The nervous system realizes that no action is required in this moment. No movement, no decision, no vigilance. And when that realization settles, the body enters a deeper state of trust. This trust is fragile. It can be broken by effort. Trying to sleep keeps awareness active. Trying to relax introduces control. Trying to empty the mind gives the mind a task. The brain interprets tasks as signals to stay online. What it needs instead is surrender. Not surrender as giving up, surrender as ceasing to interfere. This is why sleep often arrives when you stop caring whether it does. The moment the outcome becomes irrelevant, the brain stops monitoring, and monitoring is the last barrier. As awareness thins further, something else begins to change. Time. Moments lose their edges. There is no clear before or after. Thoughts don't finish, they dissolve. This temporal blur is not confusion. It's a feature. The brain is disengaging from sequential processing. Sequence requires memory. Memory requires identity. Identity requires vigilance. Sleep requires none of these, so the brain lets them fade. At this stage, memories no longer replay in any recognizable form. They don't even appear as feelings. They are being handled elsewhere. Deep structures take over, the ones responsible for consolidation, integration, and long-term recalibration. These structures don't think, they balance. They strengthen some connections and weaken others. They reinforce patterns that led to safety and reduce the influence of those that didn't. They redistribute emotional weight. This process is silent. You will never experience it directly. What you experience instead is disappearance. Not falling asleep, but fading out. And just before that happens, there is often a moment of stillness so complete it feels almost empty. No thoughts pressing forward, no sensations demanding attention, no sense of self-narrating experience. Many people misinterpret this emptiness as boredom or discomfort and instinctively disrupt it. They reach for a thought. They move their body. They check their phone. But this emptiness is not a void. It is clearance. The brain has finished its checks. Nothing remains that requires conscious oversight, so it opens the final gate. Conscious awareness slips away, not abruptly, but by thinning until it can no longer sustain itself. What follows is not darkness. It is activity without awareness. The brain enters its most industrious phase. Emotional memories are decoupled from their original intensity. New learning is integrated with existing frameworks. Patterns of response are refined. The replay you experienced earlier, the one that felt intrusive or repetitive, serves a purpose here. Each replay softened the emotional charge enough for this deeper work to proceed. Without that preparation, sleep would remain shallow, fragmented, unrestorative. This is why nights filled with mental activity often precede deeper sleep later. The brain insists on doing its work in order, and once the order is complete, it commits fully. This commitment is what allows you to sleep through noise, through movement, through time, passing unnoticed. The mind that struggled to settle earlier is no longer present to interrupt the process. Only the body remains. Breathing, circulating, repairing. When you eventually emerge from this state, hours later, it may feel as though no time passed at all. That sensation is not an illusion. Conscious timekeeping was offline. But beneath that absence, the brain was anything but idle. It was rewriting priorities, quietly adjusting what will feel heavy tomorrow and what will feel light. You will not remember this work. You will feel its effects, perhaps as a sense of relief without explanation, perhaps as emotional distance from something that once felt close, perhaps as a subtle shift in how you react. And sometimes you will wake up feeling unsettled, unsure why. That too is part of the process, because not every adjustment is complete in one night. Some require multiple passes, multiple descents into this threshold state, multiple nights where awareness dissolves just enough for deeper layers to be touched. The brain is patient. It does not rush healing. It prioritizes stability over speed. So if tonight feels like hovering rather than sleeping, that's not a setback. It may mean the brain is working closer to the surface, still sorting, still testing, still ensuring safety. And if tonight leads you fully into unconsciousness, that does not mean everything is finished. It means enough was done to allow rest. Tomorrow night, the process will begin again, not from the beginning, but from wherever the brain left off. Because sleep is not a single event. It is a nightly negotiation between consciousness and survival. And every night, the terms shift slightly. Based on what you lived, what you felt, what you avoided, what you allowed. As you move deeper into this cycle, another question quietly forms beneath awareness. If sleep can soften memory, if it can loosen identity, if it can recalibrate emotional weight, then what happens when this process is interrupted? What happens when the brain never fully reaches this depth? What changes when replay is cut short, night after night? That question does not belong to tonight, but it waits, and it will surface the next time your mind struggles to let go. When the brain is not allowed to finish what it started, memory does not soften, it sharpens. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of sleep deprivation. People assume that less sleep simply means more tiredness, slower thinking, lower energy. But beneath those surface effects, something more subtle and more destabilizing takes place. The brain remembers too well. Without enough deep sleep, emotional experiences are never fully downgraded. The images remain vivid. The sensations remain intense. The nervous system continues to treat the past as if it were current. This is why, after a night of poor sleep, the world can feel slightly louder. Conversations feel heavier. Small frustrations carry unexpected weight. It's not that life became more difficult overnight. It's that the brain failed to recalibrate. During healthy sleep, emotional memories are gradually stripped of their urgency. The facts remain, but the charge fades. This allows the mind to respond to the present without being hijacked by the past. When that process is interrupted, the charge stays intact, the memory remains armed, and the brain, unable to distinguish between unresolved memory and immediate threat, reacts accordingly. This is why insomnia is rarely just about not sleeping. It's about what happens to memory when sleep is incomplete. Each night, the brain expects to pass through a sequence: review, soften, integrate, release. When that sequence is broken, the brain carries unfinished emotional material into the next day. At first, this may feel manageable: a little irritability, a little sensitivity, a vague sense of tension without a clear source. But over time, the accumulation matters. Unprocessed emotional signals stack. The nervous system becomes hyper-responsive. It starts reacting not only to what is happening now, but also to echoes of what has not been resolved. This is when memory begins to intrude during waking hours. A comment reminds you of something old. A tone triggers an outsized reaction. A neutral situation feels charged for reasons you can't explain. The brain is no longer replaying memory only at night. It's leaking into the day. This leakage is not random. It follows a pattern. Memories that were meant to be softened during sleep remain vivid. The brain keeps them accessible because, from its perspective, they are still unfinished business. And unfinished business demands attention, so the mind circles back again and again, not because it wants to dwell, but because it hasn't been given the conditions necessary to let go. This is why people with chronic sleep disruption often describe feeling stuck in their thoughts. Not racing in the traditional sense, but looping. The same concerns, the same emotional reactions, the same internal dialogues repeating with little variation. These loops are not failures of willpower. They are symptoms of interrupted processing. The brain is trying to do its job without the tools it needs. And here is where things become more complicated. When emotional memories stay sharp, the brain begins to adjust its expectations of the world. It becomes more cautious, more vigilant, more reactive. This is not pessimism, it is adaptation. From the brain's perspective, if past emotional experiences still feel intense, it assumes similar experiences may happen again. So it prepares. That preparation shows up as tension. Muscles stay slightly engaged. Breathing remains shallow. Attention scans more aggressively. This constant readiness makes it even harder to sleep the following night. The nervous system does not easily power down when it believes there is unfinished danger. So, a cycle begins. Poor sleep leads to sharper memory. Sharper memory leads to heightened vigilance. Heightened vigilance makes sleep more difficult. And each night, the replay becomes more intrusive. Not because the memories themselves are worsening, but because their emotional volume is never turned down. This is why advice like "just don't think about it" is ineffective. Thinking is not the problem. The problem is that the brain never reaches the depth where thinking dissolves into processing. Without that depth, the system stays stuck between awareness and rest. Hovering. This hovering state feels restless, but it is actually a form of exhaustion. The brain is tired of carrying unresolved signals. yet unable to release them, so it continues to replay them in hopes that something will change. That change rarely comes during wakefulness. Wakefulness is for action, not integration. Integration belongs to sleep. This explains why a single good night of deep rest can sometimes bring disproportionate relief. Nothing externally changed, but internally, the brain finally completed a delayed task. The emotional charge dropped, the urgency faded, the loop loosened. This relief often feels mysterious. People wake up lighter without knowing why, or calmer towards something that felt overwhelming the day before. They assume time healed it, but time alone did nothing. Sleep did, yet when sleep is consistently cut short, this healing mechanism remains offline. The brain adapts, but at a cost. It starts relying more heavily on conscious control to manage emotional load. You become more analytical, more guarded, more effortful in your regulation. This can feel like resilience, but it's expensive. Conscious control requires energy. It keeps the system alert. It prevents full rest. And eventually, even that control begins to falter. Emotions break through unexpectedly. Memories surface at inconvenient times. Sleep becomes fragmented even when exhaustion is high. The brain is caught between two incompatible demands: stay alert and recover. It cannot do both, so it compromises. Sleep becomes lighter. Dreams become more intense. Awakenings become more frequent. And memory, still sharp, continues to exert influence. This is why people with long-term sleep issues often describe their memories as close, as if the past is always nearby, not distant, not archived, but hovering just beneath the surface. The brain, deprived of its nightly reset, never creates enough distance, and without distance, perspective is hard to maintain. Everything feels immediate. This immediacy shapes how you see yourself as well. When emotional memory remains intense, identity tends to narrow. You begin to define yourself by what still hurts, what still worries, what still feels unresolved. Not because that's who you are, but because that's what the brain keeps accessible. Sleep normally broadens identity by loosening emotional fixation. Without it, identity tightens. And with that tightening comes rigidity. Beliefs feel more absolute. Reactions feel more justified. Change feels more threatening. This rigidity feeds back into the system. The more rigid the mind becomes, the harder it is to relax. The harder it is to relax, the harder it is to sleep. Again, the cycle reinforces itself. But this cycle is not permanent. It is a condition, not a destiny. The brain does not forget how to process emotion. It simply needs the right conditions to resume. Those conditions are not created by force. They emerge when safety returns to the nervous system, when vigilance eases, when expectation drops, when the mind stops demanding immediate resolution. This is why rest often begins improving, not when problems are solved, but when pressure is removed. Pressure tells the brain to stay alert. Permission tells it to soften. And permission is not a decision. It is a state the brain recognizes when effort falls away, which brings the process back to where it began. The moment before sleep, the replay, the quiet sorting. When sleep is shallow or fragmented, replay never reaches completion. But when conditions align, even briefly, the brain picks up where it left off. It resumes softening. It resumes integrating. It resumes releasing. This does not require perfection. Even partial depth can reduce emotional intensity. Even fragments of true rest can make a difference. The brain works with what it's given. and it never stops trying. So if memory feels sharp right now, if the past feels closer than you want, it may not be because you're stuck. It may be because the process that creates distance has been interrupted. And distance, for the brain, is not forgetting. It is safety. Safety enough to let go. In the next phase of the night, the brain attempts to restore that safety, not by revisiting memory again, but by changing how memory connects to emotion altogether. That shift does not happen at the surface. It happens deeper, where feelings are no longer tied to stories, where charge can finally be separated from content, and understanding that separation changes how we think about healing itself. Because healing, in the brain's language, is not about erasing the past. It is about teaching the nervous system that the past no longer predicts the present, and that lesson, more than any other, is taught in sleep. After memory sharpens, the brain does something unexpected. It stops asking what happened and starts asking what kind of person am I because of it. This shift is quiet, almost invisible, but it changes everything. Up until this point in the night, the brain has been working with experiences, events, people, sensations, emotional charges. It has been sorting, softening, testing whether something is still dangerous or still useful. But now, as sleep pressure deepens and conscious structure weakens, the brain turns inward in a different way. It turns toward identity, not identity as you consciously define it, not the story you tell yourself during the day, but the implicit identity, the one built from repeated emotional conclusions, the kind that doesn't say, I believe, but instead says, this is how things are. These conclusions form quietly over time. If you are often unheard, the brain may conclude that silence is safer. If closeness led to pain, the brain may conclude that distance protects. If effort brought approval, the brain may conclude that rest is risky. None of these are deliberate beliefs. They are patterns. And patterns, once established, shape perception automatically. During the day, these identity patterns guide behavior efficiently. You don't think about them, you just act. At night, when action is no longer required, the brain finally has space to evaluate them. Not logically, somatically. It asks, is this pattern still necessary? Does it still serve survival? Does it still match the environment we're in now? This evaluation does not feel like a question. It feels like discomfort without cause, a sense of unease, a vague restlessness, a feeling that something about you doesn't quite fit anymore. Many people mistake this sensation for anxiety, but it is not fear of what might happen. It is tension between who you have been and who you no longer need to be. The brain is detecting mismatch, and mismatch requires adjustment, but adjustment at the level of identity is delicate. Changing a belief about the world is simple. Changing a belief about yourself is destabilizing. So the brain approaches this carefully. It does not confront identity patterns head-on. Instead, it places them in a softened state where awareness is dim, defenses are lowered, and the nervous system is not preparing for immediate action. Sleep is the only state where this is reliably possible. In this state, the brain allows identity patterns to surface indirectly. You may notice it as replaying moments where you felt like yourself, remembering times you acted differently than you do now, feeling drawn to past versions of you without knowing why. These are not nostalgia, they are reference checks. The brain is comparing who you were, who you became, and who you might be allowed to become next. This comparison happens without language. You don't think, "I have changed." You feel it as a slight disorientation, as a loosening of certainty, as a quiet question with no words attached. This is where many people feel most vulnerable before sleep, because certainty is comforting. Even painful certainty feels safer than ambiguity. And when identity patterns begin to soften, ambiguity increases. You may feel briefly unanchored, not unhappy, just undefined. The brain notices this and slows the process. It does not want to destabilize you, so it introduces something familiar. Old memories, old roles, old self-images, not to trap you, but to check whether they still fit. If the old pattern still calms the nervous system, the brain keeps it. If it doesn't, if it feels tight, outdated, or draining, the brain marks it for revision. This revision does not happen in one night. Identity is layered. Some layers formed early, some formed under stress. Some formed to protect you when no other option existed. The brain respects these layers. It does not discard them recklessly. Instead, it begins a slow decoupling, separating usefulness from truth. A pattern may have been useful once without being universally true. At night, the brain tests this distinction. It allows you to exist briefly without relying on a familiar identity pattern and observes what happens. Does danger appear? Does safety collapse? Does the body panic? Often, nothing happens, and that nothing is powerful, because nothing happening means the pattern is no longer required. This is how identity changes at the neurological level, not through insight, not through affirmation, but through repeated experiences of safety without the old rule. Sleep provides those experiences. Tiny ones, subtle ones, so subtle you will never remember them, but the brain does. This process explains something that confuses many people. Why personal change often feels invisible while it's happening, and obvious only in hindsight. The brain updates identity quietly, below awareness. You don't feel different overnight. You just notice one day that certain reactions no longer occur, that certain thoughts don't arise, that certain triggers have lost their power. This is not forgetting who you were. It's releasing who you no longer need to be. But during the transition, there is friction, because old patterns do not dissolve cleanly. They fade, and while fading, they can resurface unexpectedly, especially at night, not because the brain is undoing progress, but because it is double-checking. Is this layer ready to go? Is the system stable without it? If the answer is uncertain, the brain pauses. If the answer is yes, it proceeds. And as more layers soften, the sense of self becomes quieter, less defended, less rigid, less defined by past adaptation. This quieting can feel uncomfortable if you're used to effort. Effort creates identity. Struggle creates boundaries. When those loosen, there can be a sense of emptiness. But this emptiness is not loss, it is capacity. Capacity for a different baseline. A baseline that does not require constant monitoring or self-protection. As the night deepens further, identity becomes less relevant. The brain no longer needs to evaluate who you are. It shifts its attention again, away from self-concept toward emotional tone, because beyond identity patterns lies something even more fundamental: mood. Not mood as in happiness or sadness, but emotional climate, the background feeling that colors everything else. And that climate, too, is adjusted during sleep. but not in the way you might expect. The brain does not aim to make you feel good. It aims to make you feel regulated, balanced enough to respond to tomorrow without overreaction. This next stage is quieter still, less personal, less story-driven, and it begins when identity no longer needs active maintenance, when who you are can rest and the system can focus on how it feels to exist at all. That transition is subtle, but it marks another turning point in the night, one where the mind moves away from self and toward equilibrium, and from there, the deepest form of healing begins. When identity loosens its grip, the brain does not rush to replace it. It lets the space remain. This moment, often unnoticed, is where emotional climate begins to shift. Not emotion as a reaction, not emotion tied to memory, but the background tone that quietly hums beneath everything you experience. During the day, this tone is masked by activity, tasks, conversations, responsibilities. All of them sit on top of it like layers of sound. You rarely notice the bass line because there is always something louder happening. At night, when those layers fall away, the bass line reveals itself. Some people feel it as heaviness, some as emptiness, some as a low, restless tension that doesn't seem attached to anything specific. This is not a mood caused by thought. It is a physiological state the brain has been carrying for a long time. Emotional climate is formed slowly. It is shaped by repetition, by what your nervous system has learned to expect from life: safety or threat, support or unpredictability, ease or constant adjustment. Unlike emotions, climate does not spike and resolve. It lingers, and because it lingers, the brain treats it as important. Sleep is the only time when the brain can recalibrate this baseline without interference. But recalibration does not mean forcing positivity. The brain is not trying to make you happier. It is trying to make you stable. During the night, once identity patterns soften enough to stop dominating attention, the brain begins scanning for imbalance at this deeper level. Not imbalance in thought, imbalance in tone. Is the system leaning too far toward vigilance? Is it resting too heavily in withdrawal? Is it stuck in low-level alertness without release? These questions are not asked consciously. They are sensed through internal feedback loops. Hormone levels, neurotransmitter availability, autonomic nervous system bias. If the brain detects that the system is tilted too far in one direction, it begins subtle corrections. These corrections do not feel like actions. They feel like shifts. A heaviness lifting slightly, a tightness easing without reason, a sense of neutrality where there was once tension. Often these shifts happen during the deepest phases of sleep, far beyond awareness. But the preparation begins earlier. It begins in the moments before full unconsciousness, when awareness is dim but still present enough to register sensation. That's why some nights you feel emotionally raw before falling asleep, not sad, not anxious, just open. That openness is not weakness, it is access. The brain can only adjust emotional climate when defenses are down. Defenses are useful during the day. They help you navigate complexity, unpredictability, social demand. But at night, they become obstacles. So the brain encourages them to soften by slowing thought, by blurring memory, by loosening identity. Once those layers thin, emotional tone becomes reachable. And here's where the process becomes counterintuitive. If your baseline emotional climate has been heavy for a long time, the brain does not immediately lighten it. Sudden shifts feel unsafe. Instead, The brain moves gradually. It allows the heaviness to be felt without amplification, not pushed away, not dramatized, just present. This is why nights of deep emotional awareness can feel intense yet strangely calm at the same time. You feel more, but react less. That combination is rare during waking life, but it is essential for recalibration. The brain is learning something important in these moments. That feeling does not always require action. That sensation can rise and fall on its own. That presence does not equal danger. Each time the nervous system experiences emotion without mobilizing, it updates its expectations. Over time, this changes the baseline, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that the system becomes more flexible, more resilient, less reactive. This is why emotional healing often feels like less effort rather than more understanding. The brain is not seeking explanation, it is seeking balance, and balance is achieved through experience, not insight. This process also explains why some people feel emotionally lighter after sleeping, even if nothing in their life situation has changed. The circumstances remain, but the tone has shifted, the background weight has redistributed. What once felt overwhelming now feels manageable, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer dominates the system. Sleep made room. But when sleep is fragmented or shallow, this recalibration remains incomplete. The emotional climate stays skewed, and over time, the brain adapts to that skew as if it were normal. This is how chronic emotional states form, not from constant distress, but from lack of reset. The brain stops trying to correct what it never gets the chance to adjust, which is why deep sleep is not just rest, it is emotional maintenance. Without it, the system slowly drifts, and when it drifts too far, even neutral experiences begin to feel heavy. The brain interprets the world through a biased filter, not because the world is worse, but because the baseline is off. At night, when identity and narrative quiet down, the brain attempts to realign that baseline. But this realignment cannot happen if awareness keeps intruding. Checking thoughts, monitoring sensations, judging the process. Monitoring equals vigilance. Vigilance blocks recalibration, so the brain uses a familiar strategy. It pulls attention away from content, away from meaning, away from self, and towards something simpler, something universal. Breath, weight, gravity. As awareness narrows, emotional tone becomes less personal, less tied to story, and in that neutrality, adjustment becomes possible. This is why people sometimes wake up with a different emotional quality than they fell asleep with. They may not remember dreaming. They may not remember anything at all, but the system feels altered, softer, clearer, more spacious. That change did not come from thought, it came from regulation. But there is still another layer involved, because emotional climate does not exist in isolation. It is deeply tied to memory networks, and once the baseline shifts, the brain begins revisiting memories again, but in a different way, not to replay them, but to reassign them, to update their emotional weight based on the new tone. This is where memory healing becomes permanent, not just softened temporarily, but reclassified. And that process, memory reassignment, requires the brain to enter one of its most specialized states, a state where learning happens without awareness, where the past is rewritten quietly, where the emotional meaning of events is altered without changing the facts. That state does not feel like thinking. It does not feel like dreaming in the way you remember dreams. It feels like nothing, and yet it is one of the most active states the brain ever enters. As the night continues and awareness fades further, the brain moves toward that state, where emotional climate and memory finally meet, where the past is adjusted to fit the present, where what once felt close begins to move away, and where the mind prepares you silently for a future that feels slightly less heavy than the one before. That transition is subtle. You will not feel it happen, but it marks the point where sleep stops being preparation and becomes transformation. And that transformation unfolds beyond the reach of thought, in the dark, in the quiet, while you're no longer watching. When emotional climate begins to settle, memory returns, but not as you recognize it, not as scenes, not as stories, not even as feelings. It returns as fragments without urgency. This is the stage where the brain stops replaying the past and starts rewriting its weight. Earlier in the night, memory came forward loudly because it needed attention. It needed to be felt again, tested, softened. But now, after identity has loosened and emotional tone has been adjusted, memory is no longer asking to be seen. It is asking to be placed. The brain is extraordinarily sensitive to emotional context. The same memory can feel completely different depending on the internal state in which it is recalled. During the day, memory is pulled into an alert system. Everything is measured against threat, usefulness, relevance. At night, once the system has settled, memory is evaluated under calmer conditions. And under calm, memory changes, not the facts, the importance. The brain begins to reassess what each memory should mean going forward. This process does not involve conscious choice. You're not deciding what matters. The brain is. It asks questions that are not heard, but felt. Does this memory still predict danger? Does it still shape behavior? Does it need to remain easily accessible? If the emotional climate has shifted toward balance, many memories receive a different answer than they did before. They are no longer urgent. So, the brain begins to move them, not erase them, not suppress them, but relocate them from active storage to background. This relocation is subtle. You won't notice it as a moment of insight. You may notice it days later when something that once triggered you doesn't. When a thought that used to pull you inward passes without momentum. When a memory surfaces and feels oddly flat, as if it belongs to someone else. This is not detachment. It is reassignment. The brain has changed the category the memory belongs to, but before it can do this confidently, it must test the memory under the new emotional tone. So it brings fragments forward, not whole scenes, just hints, a color, a sound, a brief sensation. These fragments pass through awareness lightly, without demanding reaction. The brain watches. If the nervous system stays calm, the reassignment continues. If tension spikes, the brain pauses. This testing happens below conscious awareness, but you may feel its surface effects, a sense of drifting through unrelated thoughts. Moments where images appear and dissolve quickly, a feeling that the mind is busy without being noisy. This is not distraction, it is sorting at high speed. During this phase, memory is no longer personal, it is data, and data is easier to reorganize when it is not emotionally charged. That is why this stage of sleep feels so empty from the inside. There is no narrative left to follow, no self to anchor to, just movement. The brain uses this opportunity to perform one of its most important functions, emotional decoupling. It separates what happened from how it made you feel. Earlier, this separation began. Now, it becomes structural. Neural connections linking memory content to emotional response are weakened, not removed, weakened. This distinction matters. A weakened connection can be bypassed easily. It no longer hijacks attention. It no longer triggers the body automatically. It becomes optional. This is what people mean when they say something doesn't affect them anymore. The memory still exists, but the pathway to reaction has thinned. Sleep is the only state where this thinning can happen efficiently. During waking life, strong emotional connections are reinforced by attention. Each time you react, the pathway strengthens. At night, attention is absent, so the brain can quietly adjust the wiring. This is not dramatic work. It is methodical, and it happens repeatedly, night after night. Some memories require many passes, others resolve quickly. The brain knows which ones can be released safely, and which ones still need monitoring. This explains why some issues seem to heal gradually without effort, while others linger stubbornly. The difference is not willpower, it is emotional readiness. The brain does not decouple a memory until it believes the system can handle life without that response. Once decoupling reaches a certain threshold, the memory changes character. It stops appearing before sleep. It stops intruding during the day. Not because it is gone, but because it is no longer useful to keep near the surface. This is also why people sometimes feel a strange sense of loss when something finally heals. A reaction disappears, and with it, a familiar part of identity. The brain notices this too, so it proceeds carefully. It does not remove too much at once. It balances release with stability. And that balance is guided by emotional climate. If the baseline remains regulated, the brain continues. If the system destabilizes, it slows down. This constant adjustment is why sleep is not uniform. Some nights are deep, some nights are light, some nights feel emotionally active, others feel empty. None of these are mistakes. They reflect what the brain is working on. At this stage of the night, dreams, if they occur, are often abstract, not story-like, not memorable. They may consist of shifting shapes, strange transitions, incomplete scenes. These are not messages. They are byproducts. The brain is reorganizing memory networks, and fragments sometimes surface into awareness as collateral. You don't need to interpret them. They are not meant to be understood. Understanding belongs to the waking mind. This stage belongs to the integrative mind. As reassignment continues, the brain reaches a point of temporary equilibrium. Memory is quieter, emotion is balanced, identity is offline. The system is stable enough to remain in deep sleep for extended periods. This is where physical restoration accelerates. But the mental work does not stop. Now that emotional weight has been redistributed, the brain begins strengthening what remains. Connections that support learning, patterns that led to safety, responses that worked. Sleep is not only about letting go, it is also about reinforcing what should stay. But reinforcement happens differently than learning during the day. It is quieter. It does not involve effort or awareness. It feels like nothing. And yet, it determines how you will respond tomorrow. Which memories will come easily, which emotions will rise first, which reactions will feel natural. This is why you can wake up with a different orientation to life without knowing why some decisions feel clearer, why some worries feel distant, why some attachments loosen overnight. The brain did not solve anything consciously. It adjusted the field. But before morning comes, the brain performs one more pass. It checks coherence, not memory coherence, system coherence. Are emotional responses aligned with the updated baseline? Is identity flexible enough to adapt tomorrow? Is vigilance low enough to allow engagement? If the answers are acceptable, the brain remains in deep sleep. If not, it may surface partial awareness again. This is why some nights include brief awakenings, not because something is wrong, but because the brain needed to verify stability at a lighter level before continuing. These awakenings are functional. They are checkpoints. Once coherence is confirmed, the brain descends again, and each descent builds on the last. Gradually, across the night, the system becomes more integrated. By morning, the result is not perfection, it is readiness. You wake not as a blank slate, but as a system that has been quietly tuned, and you may never know exactly what was adjusted, but you will feel the difference in small ways, in how quickly you recover from stress, in how much space exists between feeling and reaction, in how certain memories no longer pull you backward. This is the invisible work of sleep. Not dramatic, not obvious, but foundational. And when this work is interrupted, when sleep is shortened, fragmented, or denied, the brain carries unfinished adjustments into the day, which is why the next stage of this exploration matters. Because the brain does not simply fail when sleep is disrupted. It adapts, and those adaptations change how memory, emotion, and identity interact over time. Understanding that adaptation explains why some people feel permanently tired even when they rest, and why some memories seem impossible to soften. That story continues, but for now, as the night deepens, the brain completes another quiet pass, another reassignment, another release, and awareness remains absent long enough for the work to hold, until the cycle turns again, toward morning, toward wakefulness, toward a mind that will carry the night's changes forward without ever knowing exactly how they came to be. When the brain finishes reassigning memory, it does not immediately turn toward the future. First, it pauses, not in stillness, but in balance. This pause is difficult to describe from the inside because awareness is already thin. You are no longer watching thoughts pass. You are no longer following sensations. You are not even aware of time in a continuous way. And yet, the brain is highly active. What it is doing now is something very different from replay or release. It is testing coherence, not coherence of ideas, not coherence of story, but coherence of the whole system. Earlier in the night, the brain softened emotional charge, loosened identity patterns, and redistributed the weight of memory. That work was local, memory by memory, pattern by pattern. Now it zooms out. It asks a broader question, one that has nothing to do with the past. Does this system make sense as a whole? This question is not philosophical. It is physiological. The brain checks whether emotional tone, memory accessibility, and bodily regulation are aligned, whether the nervous system is likely to overreact tomorrow, whether certain triggers are still wired too tightly, whether vigilance is set too high or too low. Think of it less as judgment and more as calibration. A musical instrument, after tuning each string, must still be checked as a whole. One string slightly off can throw everything else out of balance. So the brain listens, not to sound, to internal feedback. heart rate variability, breathing consistency, the ease with which the system transitions between states. If something is off, the brain does not panic. It adjusts. This adjustment is subtle. You will not experience it as a thought or a dream. You might experience it, if anything, as a fleeting moment of partial awareness, an almost waking, followed by a deeper drop. This is why some people wake briefly in the middle of the night, without knowing why. Not startled, not anxious, just surfaced. Those moments are often coherence checks. The brain rises slightly toward awareness to see whether the system holds together under lighter conditions. If it does, it sinks again. If it doesn't, it may repeat earlier steps, bringing up emotion, memory, or sensation until balance is restored. This is not inefficiency, it is precision. The brain does not assume its work is done. It verifies. And here's where a common misunderstanding appears. People often assume that deep sleep is a passive state, and waking up is a failure of that state. But for the brain, brief awakenings are not failures. They are tests. Just as a pilot might adjust altitude to check stability, the brain shifts levels of awareness to confirm regulation. Only when stability is confirmed does it allow prolonged depth. This also explains why some nights feel fragmented but restorative, while others feel long but unrefreshing. It's not the number of awakenings that matters, it's whether the system re-enters depth easily afterward. If it does, the brain considers the work successful. If it does not, something remains unresolved. At this stage of the night, the brain is no longer concerned with individual memories. It is concerned with patterns of response. How quickly does the system escalate? How easily does it settle? How flexible is attention? These qualities matter more for survival than any specific event. So, the brain uses what it learned earlier in the night to adjust thresholds. Thresholds for stress, thresholds for engagement, thresholds for rest. If emotional climate was heavy earlier, thresholds are gently raised, so small stressors tomorrow won't feel overwhelming. If vigilance was too low, thresholds may be lowered slightly to ensure alertness when needed. This is not about making you calm or energized. It's about making you appropriate. Appropriate to the environment you are likely to face. The brain is always predictive, even in sleep, but now its predictions are abstract. Not what will happen, but how much reactivity will be required. This is why sleep can change how you respond to the same situation without changing your thoughts about it. The prediction has shifted, the baseline has moved, and with that shift, the same stimulus produces a different response. This is adaptation at its deepest level, not cognitive, biological. As the brain finishes this calibration pass, something else begins to happen. Memory networks that were weakened earlier are now tested against the new baseline, not by replaying them, but by imagining their absence. This is difficult to describe because it does not produce images or thoughts. It produces space. The brain simulates what it would be like to move through the world without certain reactions, without certain tensions, without certain automatic responses. If the simulation feels stable, the change holds. If it feels destabilizing, the brain reverses slightly. This is why healing often comes in waves. One night, a reaction disappears. Another night, it briefly returns, then fades again. This is not regression. It is cautious implementation. The brain prefers reversibility. It does not burn bridges unless it is certain. And certainty, for the nervous system, means repeated safety. which is why sleep works cumulatively, not one night, but many. Each night, the brain reevaluates with updated data. What happened today? How did the system respond? What changed? Sleep integrates that data quietly. No reflection required, no insight necessary. This is why people often change in ways they can't explain. They become less reactive, more patient, less attached to old narratives, not because they decided to, but because their brain updated the system while they were gone. At this stage of the night, dreaming, if present, is often fragmented or absent from memory. Dreaming here is not storytelling. It is more like abstract activation, random feeling images, non-linear transitions, emotional tones without plot. These dreams are not messages. They are the mind passing signals between networks as they synchronize. You don't need to understand them. They are not meant for the waking self. They are meant for the system. As the brain approaches the final deep cycles of the night, its focus slowly shifts again from adjustment to preservation. It begins reinforcing what it has decided should remain. Patterns that led to regulation, responses that reduced conflict, associations that felt safe. This reinforcement is quiet but powerful. It determines what will feel natural tomorrow, what will come easily, what will feel effortful, what will barely register at all. This is why some changes feel effortless once they've happened. Effort was required during adaptation, not during expression. By the time you notice the change, the work is already done. But this preservation has a limit. The brain does not want to lock everything in. Life requires flexibility. So, as morning approaches, it begins preparing for the return of awareness, gradually increasing responsiveness, gradually reactivating attention, gradually bringing identity back online. This re-entry is as careful as the descent was, because waking up too abruptly can undo regulation. So the brain stages the return, and as it does, it leaves behind traces of the night's work. You might notice them as a lighter emotional tone, a quieter mind, a sense of distance from something that felt close before, or sometimes the opposite, a sense of clarity about something that needs attention. Both are signs that integration occurred. The brain does not choose outcomes based on comfort. It chooses based on alignment. What will allow the system to function best today? That is its only question. And it answers that question every night, silently, patiently, without asking for your involvement. So if you ever wonder why sleep feels so essential, why a single night can change your experience so deeply, it's because sleep is not rest from life. It is recalibration for life. And when that recalibration is interrupted repeatedly, the brain adapts in other ways, less efficient ways, ways that trade long-term balance for short-term survival. Those adaptations explain why chronic fatigue feels different from simple tiredness, why memory behaves differently, why emotion feels heavier, and why identity can start to feel rigid or fragile. That story is next. Because understanding what happens when this nightly process is disrupted helps explain not only insomnia, but why the mind holds on when it should let go, and why sometimes the past feels louder than the present, even in the middle of the day. That exploration continues as the night completes another cycle, and the brain prepares once again to return you to consciousness, slightly changed, slightly adjusted, carrying work you never witnessed, but will live with all the same. When the brain begins preparing for wakefulness, it does not undo the night's work. It protects it. This is a crucial distinction. Sleep is not a temporary escape where changes dissolve at morning. What happens in the depths of the night is meant to persist, but only if it can survive contact with consciousness. So, before awareness fully returns, the brain performs one more quiet operation. It buffers. During the night, emotional weights were redistributed, memories were reassigned, identity patterns loosened, and baseline tone was adjusted. But daytime life is demanding. It pulls attention outward. It reintroduces stress, choice, performance. If the brain allowed consciousness to return too abruptly, the old patterns could snap back into place. So it eases the transition. You experience this as that soft, indistinct state before waking. Not fully asleep, not fully awake. Thoughts don't line up yet. The sense of self is present, but blurry. Time feels elastic. This is not accidental. This is where the brain tests whether the new configuration holds under light cognitive load. It allows a small amount of thinking, a hint of planning, a flicker of self-awareness, and it watches. Does emotional tone spike immediately? Does memory reassert urgency? Does vigilance return too fast? If the system stays relatively calm, the brain proceeds. If not, it slows the re-entry. This is why some mornings feel gentle and others feel abrupt, not because of the alarm clock, but because of how stable the system was at the end of the night. When the brain is satisfied, it begins restoring familiar functions. Language sharpens, time becomes linear again, identity comes back online. But identity does not return exactly as it was. It returns updated, not with new beliefs, with new defaults. Defaults are the brain's favorite tool. They don't require thought. They shape behavior quietly. After a night of successful integration, the defaults are slightly different. Emotional reactions take longer to ignite. Memories feel less intrusive. Attention feels easier to redirect. You may not notice these changes consciously, but you will live them. And because they feel natural, you won't attribute them to sleep. You'll assume something else changed. Time, perspective, circumstances. But the real shift happened while you were gone. This buffering process also explains something subtle. Why some mornings bring clarity about an issue you struggled with the day before without you having thought about it overnight. The brain did not solve the problem. It reduced the emotional noise around it. Once the noise drops, clarity appears, not as insight, as obviousness. You wake up and suddenly know what to do, not because you reasoned your way there, but because the system no longer resists the conclusion. Resistance is often emotional, not logical. Sleep removes resistance first. Understanding comes later. But this buffering has limits. If the night was fragmented, if the brain had to repeatedly resurface to check coherence or never reach sufficient depth, buffering is weaker. Changes don't hold. Old patterns return quickly. You wake feeling as if nothing shifted, or worse, feeling disoriented, as if pieces moved but never settled. This is not failure. It is why consistency matters more than any single night. The brain relies on repetition. One night introduces change. Multiple nights stabilize it. This is also why attempts to fix sleep often backfire. Trying too hard adds pressure. Pressure signals danger. Danger signals vigilance. Vigilance blocks depth. Depth is where change happens. The brain cannot be forced into this cycle. It must be invited. And invitation does not look like effort. It looks like allowing. Allowing the replay. Allowing the drift. Allowing the pauses. allowing the quiet discomfort of not controlling the process. When you stop interfering, the brain does what it has always known how to do. It regulates, it adapts, it heals. But this healing is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It shows up as absence, absence of reactivity, absence of urgency, absence of that familiar pull toward old loops. And absence is easy to miss. You don't notice what didn't happen. You just move through the day differently, lighter in places you used to brace, calmer in moments that used to tighten, more flexible where you once felt stuck. This is the quiet legacy of the night. But when buffering fails repeatedly, when sleep is consistently shallow or disrupted, the brain changes strategy. It stops trying to recalibrate deeply. It shifts into compensation mode. And compensation feels very different from healing. Compensation relies on control. More thinking, more monitoring, more effort to keep things stable. This is when people describe feeling functional but exhausted. They can get through the day, but everything costs more. Emotion costs more. Decision-making costs more. Rest costs more. Because the brain is doing work that should have been done at night, during the day. And that work is expensive. This is why chronic sleep disruption affects far more than energy. It affects emotional flexibility, memory behavior, identity stability. The brain, deprived of its nightly reset, becomes conservative. It holds on to reactions, to assumptions, to familiar patterns, not because they are good, but because change feels risky when regulation is compromised. This is the hidden reason the past can feel so loud when sleep is poor. The brain cannot afford to let go. Letting go requires trust. Trust requires depth. Depth requires conditions. And when those conditions are missing, the system defaults to what it knows. Which brings us to an important realization. The replay before sleep, the thing so many people try to stop, is not the problem. It is the gateway. It is the brain's way of opening the door to change. If you block the replay, you block the process. If you fight the drift, you prolong the tension. But if you allow the night to unfold, even imperfectly, the brain takes what it can get, and slowly, across nights, it restores what the day wears down. This restoration is not complete. Life will always challenge regulation, but sleep gives the brain a fighting chance, every night, to soften memory, to loosen identity, to rebalance emotional tone, and to carry less into tomorrow. As morning fully arrives and awareness settles back into place, you may feel nothing remarkable. That's the point. The best nights don't feel special. They feel normal. And normal, after a period of strain, is a gift the brain works very hard to give you. But the cycle does not end here, because the next night, the brain will do it again, not from the beginning, from wherever the day left its mark. And the way the day leaves its mark depends on something we haven't explored yet. How waking life feeds the replay, why certain days produce heavier nights, why some experiences demand processing immediately while others wait, why the mind seems to know, before you do, what cannot be ignored. That story belongs to the next chapter, where the direction reverses, where we move from night back into day, and begin to understand why the brain chooses specific memories to replay the moment you lie down and close your eyes. Some memories do not fade after one night, not because the brain failed, not because you resisted, but because certain memories are not asking to be softened yet. They are asking to be understood by the body. Earlier, the The brain replayed moments to release emotional charge. It loosened identity patterns. It recalibrated emotional climate. Many memories were reassigned, their urgency reduced, their pull weakened. But a small group remains. These are the memories that return again and again, often in similar forms, often at similar moments, often right before sleep. People usually interpret this as being stuck, but from the brain's perspective, repetition means something very specific. It means the lesson is incomplete, not incomplete in logic, incomplete in integration. The brain does not learn the way the mind does. It does not accept explanations. It accepts patterns of experience. And some experiences are too complex to be resolved in a single pass, especially those involving loss, attachment, or threat that unfolded slowly. These memories are not sharp. They are layered. They don't replay as one event, but as variations, slightly different angles, different emotional tones, different entry points. One night, it appears as a face. Another night, as a sensation. Another night, as a vague sense of longing or tension with no image at all. This variation is intentional. The brain is probing the memory from multiple angles, looking for stability. It is asking, does this still activate the system? Does this still shape behavior? Does this still predict something we must prepare for? If the answer remains uncertain, the memory stays active. This is why certain dreams repeat. Not exactly, but thematically. Not the same story, but the same feeling. The brain is not stuck in a loop. It is circling something important. And that importance usually has nothing to do with the past itself. It has to do with the future. These persistent memories often involve situations where the outcome was ambiguous, relationships that ended without clarity, moments where safety was inconsistent, experiences where effort did not lead to predictable results. The brain struggles with unpredictability. It can tolerate pain, it can tolerate loss, but uncertainty leaves too many variables open. So, it returns, again and again, not to relive the pain, but to reduce uncertainty, to extract a rule, to determine how similar situations should be handled next time. This is why these memories often appear when life is changing, when you're entering a new phase, facing unfamiliar challenges, approaching new forms of connection or risk. The brain senses that old rules may no longer apply, so it revisits the experiences that shaped those rules, not to punish you, but to update the playbook. At night, when defenses are down and identity is flexible, the brain has the best chance to do this work. But this work is slow, because the brain cannot rush conclusions about safety. Rushed conclusions are dangerous, so it repeats. Each repetition slightly alters the memory. The emotional charge may not drop dramatically, but subtle changes occur. The edges blur. The intensity fluctuates. The response becomes less predictable. These changes are signs of progress, even if the memory feels just as present. The brain is not measuring success by disappearance. It is measuring success by reduced determinism. Does this memory still dictate response, or does it simply exist? As long as it dictates, the brain keeps working. And this is where many people interfere without realizing it. They interpret repetition as failure. They add frustration, judgment, urgency. They tell themselves they should be over this by now. But frustration adds charge. Judgment adds meaning. Urgency tells the brain that the memory still matters. So the system keeps it active. Not because you failed, but because you reinforce the signal. The brain does not understand impatience, it understands activation. The more activated a memory feels, the more the brain assumes it must remain accessible. This is why the most effective response to recurring memories is not engagement and not suppression. It is neutrality. Neutrality tells the brain something very specific. This memory no longer requires immediate action, but neutrality cannot be forced. It emerges when the body no longer mobilizes around the memory. And mobilization is not mental, it is physical, tightening, holding breath, preparing to respond. If those reactions still occur, the brain keeps the file open. This is why repeated memories are often tied to the body. You may notice tension before you recognize the thought. You may feel a shift before you see the image. The body reacts first, the brain watches, and if the body reacts less than before, even slightly, that is progress. That slight reduction is enough to justify another pass, another night, another replay. Because the brain is patient, it will continue until the response changes, not until the memory disappears. This distinction is critical. Healing does not mean forgetting, it means non-reactivity. A memory can remain vivid and still be harmless. Once it no longer predicts danger, the brain stops prioritizing it. But until then, repetition is unavoidable. This is also why some memories only surface during specific life conditions. Stress, exhaustion, transitions. These conditions lower defenses. They make old patterns easier to access, not because things are getting worse, but because the brain senses an opportunity. Opportunity for revision, opportunity for update, opportunity to finally close a loop that was left open under pressure. So if a memory keeps returning, it is not necessarily because you are avoiding something. It may be because the brain is attempting to finish something that could not be finished at the time. The original experience may have been too overwhelming, too complex, too threatening to process fully. So the brain stored it in an active state, waiting for a safer time. Night provides that time, especially nights where awareness is dim enough to allow exposure without defense. But this also explains why these memories often feel stronger right before sleep than during the day. During the day, the brain is oriented toward action. It cannot risk destabilizing the system with unresolved material. At night, action is irrelevant, so the brain opens the archive, but not everything at once. Only what it believes might be ready. This readiness is assessed constantly. If life circumstances remain similar to the original threat, the brain delays. If conditions improve, even slightly, it tries again. This is why people sometimes report sudden changes after long periods of stagnation. One night, the memory simply doesn't appear, or it appears without charge, and they don't realize what happened. They assume they grew out of it, but the truth is quieter. The nervous system finally recognized safety, and safety allows release. But safety is not the absence of danger, it is the presence of regulation. Regulation means the system can absorb experience without escalating. Sleep is where regulation is practiced. Night after night, tiny adjustments, incremental changes. The brain does not seek dramatic resolution, it seeks reliability. And once reliability is established, once the memory no longer hijacks the system, the brain moves it from active processing to background reference, from something that demands attention to something that can be recalled without consequence. At that point, the repetition stops, not abruptly, but gradually. The memory appears less often, with less clarity, with less emotional pull. until one night you realize it hasn't appeared at all, and you didn't notice when it left. This is how the brain resolves what the mind cannot, not through understanding, through repetition without reaction. But there is an important complication. Some memories do not belong to a single event. They belong to a pattern, repeated experiences that shaped expectation. These memories are diffuse. They do not have a clear beginning or end. They are embedded in identity, and resolving them requires something different. It requires the brain to test new experiences against old expectations, which means the work does not happen entirely at night. It continues during the day. Night prepares. Day provides data, and the cycle repeats. The brain watches how you respond to new situations, how your body reacts, whether old patterns activate, and then at night, it integrates that data, adjusts expectations, softens reactions, or keeps them intact if needed. This back and forth is continuous, and it explains why some changes feel slow but permanent, because they are not happening in thought. They are happening in the rules your nervous system uses to predict the world. Those rules change cautiously because mistakes are costly. So the brain repeats until it no longer needs to, and when repetition finally ends, what remains is not absence, it is space. Space where reaction used to be, space where vigilance once lived, space where the past no longer dictates the present. But that space does not stay empty. The brain fills it with something else: flexibility, choice, the ability to respond rather than react. That filling happens gradually, and it leads to a subtle shift in how the mind experiences time itself. Because when the past loosens its grip, the present expands, and that expansion changes how sleep itself feels. Less effortful, less crowded, more fluid. The replay slows. The nights become quieter, not because nothing is happening, but because less needs to. And as this process continues, another change emerges. The brain becomes less interested in the past altogether. It turns its attention forward, not to plan, but to prepare, which brings us to the next phase, where sleep stops focusing on what has been and starts shaping what could be, not consciously, not deliberately, but biologically, in ways you will feel before you ever understand them. That is where the story continues. There comes a point in this cycle where the brain stops asking questions, not because it has found all the answers, but because it no longer needs them. This is the stage where something subtle but decisive happens. The brain begins to release, not memories, not emotions, not identity, but control. Up until now, everything you experienced before sleep had a direction. Even the drifting, even the replay, even the repetition had purpose. The brain was sorting, testing, recalibrating, checking coherence, adjusting thresholds. But here, the direction softens. The work becomes less deliberate, and that is exactly what allows it to complete. This is the stage many people never fully reach, even when they sleep. Because reaching it requires one thing the waking mind is not good at offering: allowance, not permission given in words, allowance given in the body. Earlier, memories returned because they needed response. Then they returned because they needed neutrality. Now, they stop returning because the system has learned something essential: that emotions can exist without being managed. This is not resignation, it is trust. The brain has been testing this all along, but only now does it feel safe enough to lean into it. It has observed enough nights where sensations rose and fell without catastrophe. enough moments where awareness dimmed and nothing bad followed, enough repetitions where the body did not need to mobilize, so it stops intervening. It allows sensations to pass without containment. And this changes everything, because the brain's deepest fear is not pain, it is loss of regulation. Once it learns that regulation can hold even without constant oversight, it relaxes. This relaxation is not obvious. You don't feel it as relief. You feel it as nothing in particular, a blankness that is not empty, a stillness that is not tense, a quiet that does not demand attention. This is often where people think they are doing nothing wrong. They notice the lack of content and try to fill it. They reach for thought. They check for feeling. They look for a sign that sleep is coming. But looking is control, and control brings the mind back online. What the brain needs here is not observation. It is absence of interference. So it creates conditions where interference is difficult. Thoughts become harder to hold. Images lose clarity. The sense of time collapses, not abruptly, gradually, like fog thickening until landmarks disappear. This is not sleep yet. This is surrender of authorship. The sense that you are doing anything fades, and that fading is the signal. Once the brain senses that conscious authorship has loosened, it initiates a deeper release. It stops sending content upward. No more memories, no more emotional fragments, no more identity cues. The channel quiets. What remains is raw sensation, weight, warmth, subtle movement, and even those begin to blur. This is the point where many people experience a fleeting fear, a sense of disappearing. Not dramatic, just a whisper of unease. That unease is not danger. It is the mind noticing that it is no longer in charge. The brain registers this reaction. If the fear spikes, it pauses. If it passes, the descent continues. This is why trust matters more than technique at this stage. Trust that nothing needs to be done. Trust that nothing needs to be held. Trust that the system knows what it is doing. This trust is not intellectual. It is felt when you stop trying to feel it. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The boundary between waking and sleeping dissolves. There is no clear moment of transition, no falling asleep, just absence of tracking. Later, you will say you slept, but from the inside there was no event, only a gap. That gap is not empty. It is full of activity. The brain enters its most autonomous mode. Memory integration continues, but without emotional testing. Pattern updates continue, but without awareness. Physiological repair accelerates, and crucially, control remains offline. This is the deepest rest the nervous system knows, not because the body is inactive, but because nothing is being monitored. Monitoring is effort. Effort keeps the system alert. Alertness blocks recovery, so the brain removes the watcher. And once the watcher is gone, the system can finally reset its deepest parameters: baseline tension, default vigilance, internal pacing. These parameters are not thoughts, they are settings, and settings cannot be changed while being observed. So the brain ensures you are not there. This explains something many people struggle to articulate. Why the best sleep is the sleep you don't remember. Why the most restorative nights leave no trace. You didn't dream vividly. You didn't think deeply. You didn't process anything consciously. And yet, you wake different. That difference was created here, in the absence of awareness. But this state is fragile. it can be interrupted easily by effort, worry, anticipation. That is why chasing sleep makes it elusive. Chasing requires control. Control wakes the watcher, and the watcher prevents release. The paradox is simple. The more you try to sleep, the more you delay the condition sleep requires. This is why the brain prefers gradual descent. Replay, drift, neutrality, silence, absence. Skipping steps rarely works. Blocking, replay blocks. Descent. Suppressing thought keeps the watcher engaged. Allowing is the only path through, and allowing does not mean encouraging. It means not stopping. If a sensation arises, let it. If nothing arises, let that too. The brain does not need guidance here. It needs space. Once this stage completes, the brain remains in deep, non-interfered cycles for longer periods. This is where repair is most efficient. Hormones stabilize, immune activity shifts, neural waste is cleared, but more importantly, the nervous system recalibrates its relationship with effort. Effort is expensive. A system that must constantly manage itself cannot rest. This stage teaches the brain something fundamental. That existence does not always require management. That sensations can pass without direction. That safety can exist without vigilance. This lesson carries forward into the next day, into future nights. It makes subsequent descents easier. The brain remembers that it can let go, and once it knows that, it stops fighting the night. This is why people who finally experience deep, uncontrolled sleep often describe it as a turning point, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Something shifts. The night feels less hostile. The bed feels less like a battleground. The replay feels less threatening because the brain has learned the final step, not solving, not fixing, not understanding, but allowing. And allowing completes the loop from day to night, from activation to rest, from holding to release. But this is not the end of the process. Because once the brain has learned how to let go, it begins to use that ability in a new way, not just to release the past, but to prepare for what comes next. In the next stage, the brain does something unexpected. It starts rehearsing the future, not in images, not in plans, but in readiness. And that rehearsal begins long before morning arrives, while you're nowhere to be found. That is where we go next. Long before the brain learned language, before it learned stories, before it learned to imagine the future, it learned one thing first: how to recover. Recovery is older than thought, older than memory, older than identity. It lives in rhythms, not ideas. And sleep is the oldest form of recovery the brain knows. By the time the night reaches this depth, where control has dissolved and awareness has stepped aside, the brain is no longer reacting to the day. It is no longer cleaning up loose ends or softening emotional charge. It is doing something more fundamental. It is resetting the system itself, not resetting memories, not resetting beliefs, resetting capacity, capacity to respond, capacity to feel, capacity to engage without breaking. This is the layer people often mistake as nothing happening, because nothing is visible, no images, no dreams you remember, no thoughts to follow. But invisibility does not mean inactivity. In fact, this is when the brain is most decisive. Here, sleep becomes what it has always been throughout human history, a form of biological therapy, not therapy that explains, not therapy that analyzes, therapy that restores balance by changing how the system returns to the world. During waking life, the nervous system is constantly adjusting outward, It meets demands, absorbs stress, reacts to unpredictability. These adjustments are necessary, but they accumulate. Each adjustment leaves a trace, a slight tightening, a slight bias, a slight readiness that doesn't fully turn off. Over time, these traces add up. The system begins to operate closer to its limits. Sleep is the counterweight, and at this depth, sleep stops responding to specific problems and starts restoring baseline resilience. The brain recalibrates how much stimulation is required to trigger reaction, how much pressure is needed to activate stress responses, how quickly the system escalates, and how easily it settles. These are not conscious choices. They are threshold adjustments, and thresholds determine everything. Two people can experience the same event and react completely differently, not because of mindset, but because their thresholds are set differently. One system absorbs the input and returns to equilibrium. Another escalates and stays activated. Sleep is where those thresholds are adjusted, and not in response to one event, but in response to the pattern of recent life. The brain looks at how often the system was pushed, how long it stayed activated, how much recovery time it had. Then it decides, should we become more sensitive or more tolerant, more alert, or more relaxed? This is not about comfort. It is about survival. A system that stays too relaxed in a dangerous environment will not survive. A system that stays too tense in a safe environment will burn itself out. So the brain aims for fit to your life, not to an abstract ideal. This is why sleep does not always make you feel calmer. Sometimes it makes you feel more alert the next day, more aware, more ready. That is not a failure of rest. That is calibration. The brain decided vigilance was needed. But when sleep is deep and uninterrupted, calibration is accurate. When sleep is fragmented or shallow, calibration becomes distorted. The brain makes conservative guesses. It assumes threat. It lowers thresholds. It prepares for impact. This is why chronic sleep disruption leads to heightened reactivity. The brain, lacking reliable recovery, stops trusting the environment, and a brain that doesn't trust the environment holds on to memory, to control, to identity. At this depth of sleep, however, trust is restored, not through reassurance, through experience. The nervous system experiences hours of existence without threat, without action, without consequence. That experience teaches something no thought can, that rest does not lead to harm, that letting go does not cause collapse, that nothing bad happens when vigilance turns off. This lesson is profound. It changes how the system approaches the next day, not in belief, in posture. The body carries itself differently. Breathing patterns shift, muscle tone adjusts, attention distributes more evenly. These changes are subtle, but they alter how experiences land. A comment that would have triggered defensiveness now passes. A memory that would have intruded now stays distant. Not because you are stronger, but because your system is less depleted. This is why sleep deprivation feels different from exhaustion caused by effort. Effort tires muscles and attention. Sleep deprivation destabilizes regulation, and regulation is what determines whether the mind can let go at night in the first place. At this depth, the brain also revisits one final question, not about the past, not about identity, but about continuity. Can this system afford to disengage again tomorrow night? If the answer feels uncertain, if life is unstable, unpredictable, or overwhelming, The brain may choose to keep certain safeguards active: light sleep, frequent awakenings. Increased monitoring. This is not insomnia as failure. It is insomnia as protection. The brain believes it cannot fully power down. But when sleep reaches this depth repeatedly, the answer slowly changes. The system learns that disengagement is possible without catastrophe. Night after night, this lesson accumulates, and with it, the brain gradually releases its grip. This is why healing sleep often arrives late, not because you did something wrong, but because the system needed proof. Proof that rest would not cost survival, and proof is built slowly. At this depth, the brain also begins to prepare something else, a return, not to consciousness, but to engagement. It starts laying down patterns for how energy will be distributed tomorrow, which systems will be prioritized, which will stay quiet. This is not planning, it is orientation, a general readiness for interaction with the world. This orientation is influenced by everything that happened earlier in the night. What memories were softened, what identities were loosened, what emotional tones were adjusted. All of that feeds into how the brain prepares the system to wake. But for now, awareness remains absent. The watcher is gone. The system is alone with itself, and in that solitude, the brain finishes what it has been doing all night, not cleaning, not sorting, not fixing, but restoring capacity. The capacity to feel without being overwhelmed, the capacity to remember without reliving, the capacity to think without looping. This capacity is what people feel when they say they are well rested, not energetic, capable of meeting the day without friction. But this capacity does not appear suddenly. It emerges as the night completes its deepest cycles. And when those cycles are complete, something changes. The brain begins to turn toward the surface again, not abruptly, not fully, just enough to sense the approaching shift. The shift from night to morning, from internal focus to external engagement, from absence to awareness. And as that shift begins, the brain makes one final adjustment. It decides how much of what was learned during the night should remain accessible, how much softness can be carried forward, how much distance from the past can be maintained. That decision shapes the morning. And it leads us into the next stage, where the brain begins its ascent, not as a return to the old self, but as a continuation of a system that has been quietly changed. That ascent is not a reversal of sleep. It is the expression of what sleep accomplished. And understanding that ascent explains why mornings feel the way they do, why some mornings feel heavy, why others feel clear, why sometimes you wake with answers you never searched for, and why sometimes you wake with nothing, but still feel different. That story unfolds next, as the night gives way and the mind once again begins to surface. Before the mind fully returns, before thoughts regain their sharp edges and language starts lining itself up again, the brain passes through a narrow corridor. This corridor is not sleep. And it is not wakefulness. It is a transition state where the night's work is sealed. Nothing new is processed here. Nothing is sorted. Nothing is replayed. Instead, the brain asks one final question, quietly, almost mechanically. Is this configuration stable enough to face the world? This is not a question about confidence, not about motivation, not about optimism. It is a question about load. How much emotional weight can this system carry today without collapsing? How much memory can remain accessible without hijacking attention? How much vigilance is required before it becomes harmful? The brain does not answer this with logic. It answers by adjusting access. During this phase, memories are neither erased nor emphasized. They are gated. Some are placed closer to awareness. Others are kept further away. This is why, upon waking, certain thoughts are immediately present while others feel distant, even if they mattered deeply the day before. The brain is deciding what you can afford to carry today. This decision is influenced by everything that came before: how deep the sleep was, how complete the emotional recalibration became, how often the system had to resurface during the night. If the night allowed long periods of unbroken depth, the brain is generous. It distances emotional memory. It lowers reactivity. It allows space between stimulus and response. If the night was fractured, the brain becomes conservative. It keeps more safeguards active. It maintains tighter access to memory. It prepares for faster escalation. This is not punishment. It is protection. The brain always assumes it must keep you functional, even if that means sacrificing comfort. As this corridor unfolds, awareness begins to flicker back, not as thought, but as orientation. You may notice a sense of direction returning, a vague awareness of your body's position, a feeling of time reassembling itself. But identity is still muted. You are not yet you in the daytime sense. And this matters because identity carries obligation, roles, expectations, narratives about who you should be. The brain delays those deliberately. It wants the system to stabilize first. So it brings back awareness slowly, allowing the nervous system to test engagement without committing to it. This is why the moments before waking often feel strangely neutral. Not happy, not anxious, just present. This neutrality is not emptiness, it is buffer. The brain is creating space so that when identity returns, it does not immediately reactivate old loops. But identity does return. It always does. The question is how rigid it will be, and that rigidity depends on how much the brain had to hold on during the night. If sleep allowed release, identity comes back softer, less defensive, less urgent, less tightly bound to the past. If sleep was shallow, identity returns armored, prepared, alert, reactive. This difference is subtle but powerful. It determines whether the day feels manageable or overwhelming before it even begins. You may interpret this as mood, but mood is downstream. The source is access. What thoughts appear first? What memories are close enough to feel? What emotional tone greets consciousness? These are not random. They are selected. This selection happens here, in this corridor. And once it is complete, the brain commits. It allows full wakefulness to arrive. Language sharpens, narrative returns, the sense of I stabilizes. But the night's work remains embedded, not as insight, as default. You don't wake up thinking, I processed something. You wake up thinking whatever you always think, but the way you think has shifted, less friction, or more space, or less. And you don't notice it directly, you notice it through contrast. A situation that would have triggered you yesterday now feels distant. A memory that felt heavy now feels dull. A concern that dominated attention now feels oddly irrelevant, or the opposite. A worry feels closer, a memory feels sharper, a sense of urgency lingers. Both outcomes are information. The brain is not trying to make you feel good, it is trying to make you fit to the demands it predicts you will face. This is why you can sleep well and still wake up tense. Because sometimes tension is adaptive, and you can sleep poorly and still wake up calm. Because sometimes the brain gambles. Sleep is not a guarantee of a specific emotional outcome. It is a process of continuous adjustment. But over time, patterns emerge. Nights with deep release tend to accumulate softness. Nights with shallow rest tend to accumulate rigidity. And the brain tracks these patterns, which is why chronic sleep deprivation changes personality, not because it alters character, but because it shifts default access. The past stays closer, threat feels more present, control feels necessary, and control is exhausting. This brings us back to the replay, the thing people fear, the thing people try to stop. The replay before sleep is not the enemy. It is the opening move. It is the brain saying, there is something here that needs space. When that space is allowed, the night can do its work. When it is resisted, the system compensates elsewhere, usually during the day, which is why unresolved nights produce heavier days, and heavier days produce louder nights. But when the cycle is allowed to complete, even imperfectly, the system slowly learns something crucial, that it does not need to hold everything at once. That memory can be carried at a distance. That identity can loosen without dissolving. That awareness can turn off without danger. These lessons are not learned intellectually. They are learned somatically, night after night, in the body, in silence. As morning arrives fully, you step back into the world carrying the residue of this process. You may not recognize it, but it will shape how you move, how you listen, how you react, how quickly you tire. And as the day unfolds, new material will accumulate, new experiences, new emotional charges, new unfinished loops. The brain already knows this. It expects it. That is why it does not aim for perfection at night. It aims for enough release to continue, enough distance to function, enough flexibility to adapt. And then, when the day ends again, the cycle resumes. The replay will return, not because you failed to let go, but because letting go is not a one-time event. It is a rhythm, a daily oscillation between holding and releasing, between engagement and withdrawal, between memory and silence. Understanding this rhythm changes how you experience the night. The replay stops feeling like intrusion. It starts feeling like invitation. An invitation to allow the brain to do what it has always done best when given the chance. But there is one more layer to consider, because not all replay is equal. Some nights are gentle, others are heavy, and the difference is not random. It depends on what the day delivered, which experiences demand immediate processing, which can wait, which are too volatile to touch yet. The brain is selective. It does not replay everything, it chooses. And that choice reveals something important, something about what the mind values, not consciously, but biologically. That selection, why this memory and not another, is where the story truly began. And it is where it quietly ends. Because once you understand how the brain chooses what to replay, you no longer need to fight it. You can listen, not with effort, but with allowance. And allowance is enough. The night does the rest. And as the cycle continues, day into night, night into day, the replay grows quieter. Not because nothing matters anymore, but because less needs to be carried alone. And that is where the final turn occurs, not toward sleep, but toward living with less weight than before, which brings us to the last movement. Not a conclusion, but an opening, where the question that started all of this, Why does the mind replay the past before sleep? No longer needs a direct answer, because the body already knows, and it shows you every night by what it chooses to let go of and what it allows to fade on its own into rest. If you are still awake at this point in the night, it does not mean the process failed. It means the process is still happening closer to the surface. There is a widespread assumption that sleep must look a certain way. Eyes closed, consciousness gone, hours unbroken. Anything else feels like malfunction, like the body missed a step, but the brain does not see it that way. To the brain, being awake and being unfinished are not the same thing. Some nights, the work cannot go deep immediately. Not because you resisted, not because you thought too much, not because something is wrong with you, but because the system decided that full disappearance was not yet safe. This decision is not conscious. It is protective. The brain weighs risk constantly, not just external risk, but internal instability. If emotional charge is still high, if vigilance cannot yet drop without consequence, the brain chooses a different strategy. It keeps you near awareness, not fully awake, not fully asleep, hovering. This hovering state is uncomfortable because it feels like effort without progress. Thoughts appear, but don't resolve. Sensations shift, but don't settle. Time stretches. You may feel as if you are stuck. But from the brain's perspective, this state has value. It allows partial processing without full surrender. It allows memory to be touched lightly without overwhelming the system. It allows regulation to happen incrementally. This is especially true after days that carried emotional ambiguity, not trauma, not crisis, but subtle strain, small disappointments, unspoken tensions, moments where you adjusted yourself instead of expressing something. These experiences don't demand immediate reaction during the day, but they accumulate quietly. By night, the system is carrying more than it can easily release. So the brain compromises. It does not force depth, it stays closer to the surface. And at the surface, processing looks different. Instead of full memory reassignment, the brain focuses on containment. Containment means keeping emotional material from escalating, keeping it present enough to be acknowledged, but distant enough to prevent overload. This is why, on nights like these, thoughts feel repetitive but dull. They circle without intensifying. They appear without drama. They refuse to disappear, but also refuse to deepen. This is not rumination in the pathological sense. It is holding. The brain is holding material until conditions improve. Those conditions may not arrive tonight, and that is acceptable. The brain is not working on a deadline. It is working on stability. One of the most misunderstood aspects of sleep is this: rest does not require unconsciousness. Deep restoration is most efficient during unconsciousness, but regulation can occur while you are awake and still. If the body is not mobilizing, if breathing remains steady, if the system is not escalating, then something is happening, even if you are aware, even if you're frustrated, even if you wish you were asleep already. This is why lying still, even while awake, is not wasted time. Stillness provides data. It tells the nervous system that nothing bad is happening despite inactivity. That data matters, especially on nights when full sleep feels unreachable. The brain is always learning from state, not intention, not effort, state. If the state remains relatively calm, the brain updates its expectations. It learns that Being awake at night does not automatically mean danger. That learning makes future nights easier. But when people panic about being awake, they unintentionally reverse this learning. Panic reintroduces urgency. Urgency reactivates vigilance. Vigilance tells the brain to stay alert, and alertness keeps you hovering. This is not a moral failure. It is a feedback loop, and feedback loops require interruption, not force. Interruption comes from allowing the state to exist without commentary. This is extremely difficult. The mind wants progress. The brain wants stability. When those two wants conflict, the brain usually wins, because survival is older than preference. So if you are awake at this point in the night, consider a different interpretation. Instead of asking, "Why can't I sleep?" ask, "What is the system protecting right now?" Not in words, in posture, in breath, in tension. The answer may not be obvious. It may not even exist as a clear reason. Sometimes the brain is simply erring on the side of caution, and caution fades with familiarity. If hovering nights happen often, the brain eventually learns that hovering itself is safe. That learning allows deeper release later. This is why some people suddenly begin sleeping better without changing anything obvious. They stopped fighting the state, and the brain, no longer needing to protect against panic, loosened its grip. But there is another reason the brain may keep you near the surface. It may be waiting for completion, not completion of thought, completion of feeling. Earlier in the night, emotional material was softened, reassigned, buffered, but some feelings do not finish easily, not because they are intense, but because they are vague. Grief without a name, disappointment without a cause, longing without an object. These feelings do not resolve through replay, they resolve through presence. They need time in awareness without interpretation, time where they can exist without being shaped into story. Hovering nights provide that time. The brain allows feeling to exist in a low-intensity way, trusting that exposure without escalation will slowly drain its charge. This is slow work. It does not feel productive, but it is effective. And it does not require sleep. It requires patience. Patience is not something you generate. It is something that appears when you stop demanding change. That stopping often comes only after exhaustion, which is why many people fall asleep only after giving up on sleep. Giving up removes demand. Removing demand removes urgency. Removing urgency allows regulation. This is not irony. It is physiology. So if you are awake and the night feels long, the most helpful thing you can do is reduce additional load, not trying to fix the night, not evaluating progress, not comparing to other nights, just removing commentary. Let the brain do what it is doing. It chose this mode for a reason, and reasons do not need to be known to be valid. One of the most damaging myths around sleep is that awareness equals failure. In reality, awareness is just a different depth. Some nights require shallow work, others allow deep transformation. Both contribute. What matters is not how unconscious you become, but whether the system learns safety. Safety in stillness. Safety in quiet. Safety in not acting. These lessons accumulate, and when they do, something shifts. Not necessarily tonight, but gradually. The hovering nights become less tense. The wakefulness becomes less charged. The boundary between awake and asleep softens, and eventually, without effort, depth returns. The brain remembers that it can go there. This remembering is not intellectual. It is embodied. If tonight is a hovering night, it is not wasted. It is part of the sequence. The brain is never idle, even when you are awake, especially when you are awake without action. This is why lying awake in the dark can sometimes feel strangely meaningful, as if something is happening that you cannot see. That feeling is accurate. Something is happening. Just not at the level you expect. And when morning comes after a night like this, you may feel tired, but not destroyed, or heavy, but not overwhelmed. That is because the brain did not get full restoration, but it got enough regulation, enough to prevent escalation, enough to keep the system intact, enough to try again tomorrow night. And it will try again, because the brain does not give up on rest. It will keep negotiating with conditions until it finds a window. And when it does, it will go deep, not because you earned it, but because the system finally felt ready. This is why sleep cannot be forced, but can be trusted. Even imperfect nights contribute to the larger arc. Even wakefulness has a role. The mistake is believing that only one state is useful. The brain disagrees. It uses whatever state is available. So if you are awake now, you are not outside the process. You are inside a quieter part of it, a part that does not announce itself, a part that prepares without spectacle. And as the night thins and morning approaches, the brain will begin its ascent again, carrying whatever it managed to soften, leaving behind whatever can wait, and opening space for the final movement. Not a conclusion, but a release, where nothing more needs to be processed, where the mind does not need to understand, where the question of why the brain replays the past before sleep no longer feels urgent, because the answer has already done its work. And what remains is simply this: you are allowed to rest, even when rest does not look the way you expected. There is no clear line where the night ends. Morning does not arrive all at once. Awareness does not switch on like a light. The brain does not announce that its work is finished. Instead, everything thins. The darkness becomes less complete. The silence becomes less absolute. The distance between you and the world quietly shortens. This final movement is not about doing anything more. It is about not carrying everything back. Throughout the night, the brain has been making decisions you will never witness. Decisions about weight, about distance, about what deserves to stay close to consciousness, and what can remain further away. Now, as wakefulness approaches, the brain performs its last and most delicate act. It lets go without explanation, not letting go of memories entirely, not letting go of feelings completely, letting go of the need to hold them. This is subtle, so subtle that most people miss it. They wake up and assume they are the same as they were before sleep. Same thoughts, same life, same unresolved questions. But something is different. Something is quieter. The difference is not dramatic enough to notice directly. It appears indirectly, in what doesn't arise, in what doesn't pull your attention, in what doesn't tighten your chest, in what doesn't demand immediate interpretation. The brain has reduced the urgency of certain things, not because they no longer matter, but because they no longer need to be carried at the front. This is the quiet gift of sleep. Not clarity, not answers, distance. Distance is what allows life to be lived without constant friction. Without distance, everything feels immediate. Every memory presses forward. Every feeling asks to be resolved now. With distance, things can exist without consuming you. The brain does not create distance through logic. It creates distance through repetition, softening, reassignment, buffering, and finally, release. Release without ceremony. That is why the end of the night feels so unremarkable. There is no sense of completion, no signal that something important has happened. The system simply resumes, and that is exactly how it is meant to work. If you woke up feeling that the night had fixed you, the brain would have done too much. Sudden change is destabilizing. The nervous system prefers gradual shifts. Shifts so small that they feel like nothing, until you look back and realize you are no longer reacting the same way, no longer bracing in familiar moments, no longer replaying certain things with the same intensity. The night does not erase the past. It teaches the body how to live with the past without being governed by it. That teaching happens slowly, night after night, and some nights very little seems to happen. Those nights matter too. They reinforce safety. They remind the system that stillness is survivable. They prepare the ground. Other nights feel busy. Memories surface. Emotions stir. Awareness hovers. Those nights matter as well. They are the nights where weight is being moved, where old patterns are being tested, where the system is learning something new about itself. The mistake is assuming that only quiet nights are successful. The brain does not measure success by silence. It measures success by regulation, by whether the system can return to balance more easily than before. Sometimes balance requires activity first. Sometimes it requires hovering. Sometimes it requires deep absence. The brain chooses based on what it senses, not on what you prefer. By the time morning fully arrives, the replay has stopped. Not because everything is resolved, but because resolution is not required to live. Only regulation is. The replay exists to restore regulation. Once regulation is sufficient, the replay ends, and it will return again, because every day introduces new material, new interactions, new tensions, new unfinished moments. The brain expects this. That is why it does not aim to empty you at night. It aims to lighten you just enough. Enough to move forward, enough to engage, enough to breathe without effort. This is why the question that brought us here, why does the mind replay old memories before sleep, eventually stops needing an answer. Because the answer is not conceptual, it is experiential. The mind replays because the body needs space, because emotional weight cannot be carried indefinitely, because consciousness is not designed to hold everything at once. Sleep is the mechanism that redistributes that weight, quietly, imperfectly, repeatedly. And when it works, you don't feel cured. You feel ordinary, which is extraordinary when you think about it. To wake up without the past pressing so hard, to move through the day with a little more room inside, to lie down again at night without fear of what might surface. This ordinariness is the result of countless invisible adjustments, adjustments that did not require your understanding, only your absence. So as you rest here, whether you're drifting toward sleep or hovering in that space between, there is nothing you need to complete, no memory you must solve, no feeling you must explain, no insight you must reach. The brain knows what to do. It has been doing it long before you were aware of nights or days, long before you had words for memory or mind. All it asks is space, and space is created not by effort, but by allowing the night to pass without resistance. Eventually, without you noticing the exact moment, awareness will loosen again, or morning will arrive. Either way, the process continues, not as a conclusion, but as a rhythm, a quiet oscillation between holding and releasing, between living and letting go, between what stays and what is finally allowed to fade into rest.